Good day to you. In this main portion of the series, we shall explore the Primarchs. Necessarily, this means that we shall also be considering their father, the Emperor of Mankind. Do not concern yourselves with the exact canon timeline of the Emperor's life. That particular canon is too fuzzy to be worthwhile. I wonder whether the Great Crusade was the Emperor's first fight against chaos. There is so much time earlier in his life which we just don't know about. Perhaps he tried the idea of nurturing a human society which had a healthy relationship with its own emotions and needs during the Dark Age of technology. But when galactic human society disintegrated into the Age of Strife, he learned the wrong lesson and decided it had been doomed from the start. The only way that light could shine on this particular idea would be a canonical prequel to 40K about the earlier portions of the Emperor's life, which I would love as a video game. But without it, it's just speculation. If the Emperor had, at some point before the Age of Strife, attempted a different approach, one focused on fostering a society that was emotionally and psychologically resilient against chaos, then the catastrophic collapse of the Dark Age of technology might have convinced him that such an approach was futile. The Emperor we see in the Great Crusade is deeply pragmatic, expedient, ruthless, and obsessed with controlling humanity's development. If he had once believed in a more organic, holistic, human-centered solution to chaos, then the Age of Strife could have been the event that shattered that belief, leading him to conclude that only rigid order and absolute control could protect humanity. That would explain his rejection of religion, his suppression of individual cultural identities, and his insistence on his particular view of reason above all else. Not because he had always thought that was the best approach, but because he believed it was the only approach that wouldn't end in ruin. He was wrong about that, but whatever. It would also give more depth to the way he interacts with the Primarchs. If he saw them as tools for the Great Crusade, rather than as sons, it might not have been because he never wanted to be a father, but because he had already tried building a society based on human connection and lost everything. Of course, this is pure speculation without a proper prequel that explores those lost millennia, which would be a great series of novels or video games. But it's compelling to think that the Emperor's philosophy was not always as rigid as it later became, and that he might have learned the wrong lesson from history, choosing tyranny over trust, because trust had already failed him once. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor is akin to Cleopatra, longing for glories past, rather than a Trajan creating new glories. His obsession with the Dark Age of technology allows us to bring historical weight to understanding him. Cleopatra's legacy. Cleopatra is often remembered as a ruler whose reign was marked by a deep, tragic attachment to a bygone era of Egyptian glory. Her actions in both diplomacy and cultural patronage were in part driven by a desire to preserve and recapture the splendor of a once mighty civilization, even as external forces, that is, Rome, dominated the Mediterranean. Her leadership was tinged with nostalgia and the need to hold on to a heritage that she feared was slipping away. In contrast, Trajan's legacy. Trajan is celebrated as a Roman emperor who was actively engaged in expanding the empire and creating new glories. His military campaigns and ambitious public works projects were forward-looking, designed not merely to recapture the past, but to build a new order, a transformation that was as constructive as it was expansive, and celebrated by many later emperors, but also notably later senates of Rome. The emperor's approach was, I suppose, a hybrid vision, though I would argue more on the Cleopatra side. We can look at his actions during the Great Crusade and see elements of both models. On one hand, he was a visionary who sought to unify humanity under a single banner and create a new era of human dominance. Yet, his personal outlook was imbued with a nostalgia, longing for the lost heights of human achievement during the dark age of technology, which, remember, he lived through and remembered. His actual policies were not attempting to duplicate the enlightenment and interspecies cooperation of the dark age of technology, no, but his drafting and signing the Treaty of Mars shows us that his priority was in many ways regaining what was lost. He was uninterested in innovation, scientific advancement, or learning new things, and he made certain that the Mechanicus would be backward-facing rather than innovative by including prohibitions on certain technologies in the treaty. Many forms of creativity and innovation were suppressed or banned by the Mechanicum specifically at the behest of the emperor. He had this nostalgia for a golden age, a longing for the past. The emperor's decision to reject all alliances with Xenos, for instance, may not be read solely as a matter of ruthless pragmatism, but also as a reaction against the perceived dilution of human potential that marked the later decline in the dark age of technology. In this sense, perhaps his policies resemble Cleopatra's determination to preserve a fading culture, even as new forces, the Great Crusade, emerged on the galactic stage. Then he had this idea of preservation of human purity that we can see all through the Imperium. His absolute xenophobia and insistence on human supremacy. We can view that as an attempt to recreate or even idealize maybe, a past where humanity was uncorrupted by alien influences. This defensive posture is less about creating entirely new glories, Trajan style, and more about safeguarding an idealized memory of human greatness. If we look at his constructive vision versus his preservation ideals, the Trajan element, although the emperor did not openly embrace the kind of forward-moving, constructive expansion that characterized Trajan's reign, remember it was called the Great Reclamatory Crusade, his launching of the Great Crusade does embody a desire to extend human dominion and restore order after the chaos of the Age of Strife. Yet, rather than building an entirely new civilization free of its past, his methods, genetic manipulation, the creation of the Primarchs, and a heavy reliance on secret, often brutal intelligence operations, suggest that he was also trying to recapture lost potential. And so we have a dual legacy for the emperor. In effect, the emperor's vision may be seen as a hybrid. On one side, a drive to create a unified, powerful imperium, the Trajan-like ambition, and on the other, a yearning to reclaim and protect the inherent purity and greatness of humanity that he believed had existed and been squandered in earlier eras, the Cleopatra-like mythologizing of the past. This tension could explain many of his paradoxical policies, such as the strict xenocidal measures he imposed, and the secretive, almost nihilistic nature of his later projects like the Webway. The implications for the Imperium should not be discounted here. The thematic absence of a redemptive, conciliatory figure among the Primarchs, especially once Sanguinius dies, and the resulting dystopian nature of the Imperium can be seen as a direct consequence of the Emperor's chosen path. By prioritizing the preservation of a mythic, untainted human legacy over the possibility of forging new, inclusive glories, the Imperium was left with institutions steeped in paranoia, militarism, and internal decay. Viewed through this lens, the Emperor during the Great Crusade appears less a visionary builder of a new era as Trajan was, and more like a guardian desperate to preserve the luminous mythologized past of human achievement, one that he feared was irretrievably lost, and one which actually may not have existed. His policies, then, can be read as a kind of tragic compromise, a striving for renewed glory that is forever haunted by a lost potential it might not live up to of a more enlightened cooperative past. This duality, this tension between creating new glories and clinging to ancient ones, is a wonderful thematic element of both the Emperor's life, the Mechanicum's and later Mechanicus's policies, and the later policies of the Imperium. Now that leads us on to the next thing. The Emperor's whole plan for the Great Crusade was to eschew the practices of the Dark Age of technology and move forward into a dystopian autocracy because he believed it to be necessary. Let us imagine a counterfactual for a moment. The Emperor is nearly killed in battle. This has happened a few different times. And he realizes that he can't just have never die as a viable plan. The man had 20 demigods to which he might delegate, for goodness sake. What sort of preparations should he have made to enable continuity of governance, avoiding civil war, maintaining the Astronomicon, and allowing hope for the possibility of a successful webway project in the case of his death? I feel that we can find good options among the Primarchs to fill those roles. He would have needed to set up a resilient, institutionalized framework to guarantee the continuity of his vast, expansive imperium. Such preparations would have required both structural and personal measures designed to prevent the outbreak of civil war, like what happened after Alexander the Great died, preserve the critical psychic beacon of the Astronomicon to prevent devolving into the Age of Strife again, and to ensure that the Webway project, the linchpin in his long-term plan for humanity's salvation, had a capable steward. Here's how I think the Emperor might have approached this task, and which Primarchs might have been groomed for the various roles, if the Emperor had ever thought it was possible for the Imperium to survive past his own death. So first, got to establish a council sort of structure, rather than relying on a single heir in the conventional autocratic sense. The Emperor should have established some sort of high council or regency composed of his most trusted and uniquely skilled Primarchs. Not just humans, the Lords of Terra, This council could distribute authority. You would prevent any single Primarch from monopolizing power by assigning clearly defined spheres of responsibility. You would legitimize governance by institutionalizing decision-making through oaths and binding rituals. You'd have every Primarch, and by extension every branch of the Imperium, from the Administratum to the Navy, they could recognize and obey this collective authority. And you might be able to mitigate factionalism, provide a check against personal ambition by requiring that key decisions, perhaps those regarding military strategy or the maintenance of critical structures, be made collaboratively. There are some key preparations and measures which should have been made. First, most obviously, succession and chain of command protocols. Maybe it would have been a good idea to codify the War Master's role. He could have formalized the role of Master as the supreme military commander. Given that Horus had already served as the de facto War Master even before being elevated in that manner after Ullanor, his office could have been preserved as the face of the Imperium's war machine. However, safeguards should have been put in place because they were obviously needed to ensure that if he became compromised, or in the event of his early death, a successor could be appointed without plunging the Imperium into factional strife. He would need a clear, merit-based form of succession, as opposed to whatever the High Lords of Terra have been doing for 10,000 years. Instead of a hereditary or purely charismatic heir, the Emperor might have designated roles on the basis of proven competence. This would involve a transparent protocol, likely overseen by the other members of the High Council, to appoint successors in each key area. He really, really needed to institutionalize the Astronomicon's continuity. They just sort of slapped it together after he was put on the Golden Throne. If he had a dedicated custodian. Look, the Astronomicon is not merely a beacon of psychic power. It is the linchpin of navigation through the warp. Its maintenance should have been the responsibility of a specialized office led by a Primarch with strong psychic affinity, or even a combined effort between a trusted Primarch and a larger human organization like the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The Emperor might have designated someone like Sanguinius, whose angelic aspirational presence made him a fine choice to oversee or at least symbolically represent the Astronomicon's continuity if you didn't want a purely psychic Primarch leading it, while having it be powered by the specially trained human psychers as in canon. You need to have redundancy and ritual, which he understood. He knew about the Mechanicus. If you institute strict rituals and backup procedures, fail-safes, and so on, that would help ensure that if one guardian of the Astronomicon were lost, another could immediately assume the role, thus preventing a collapse of the global navigational network. That network, remember, is essential not only to the Great Crusade, but to the Imperium's civilian economy overall. Without it, you don't have an Imperium. You have the Age of Strife. And then, of course, we have the success of the Webway project. He viewed it as being only his own. If he had centralized technological oversight outside of himself, recognizing that the Webway project was a singular vision of transcending the limitations of the warp, the Emperor would need to appoint a dedicated overseer, not just himself, who possessed both intellectual prowess and a measure of independence from purely military concerns. Magnus the Red's potent psychic abilities and hunger for knowledge, if properly controlled, could have directed towards the perfection of the Webway project. Of course, this is a double-edged sword, given Magnus's hubris, so perhaps the Emperor might have instituted extra institutional safeguards to monitor and restrain his excesses. And of course, there would need to be collaboration with the Adeptus Mechanicus. Even if a Primarch were assigned a nominal leadership role, the technical expertise of the Mechanicus would be essential. Thus, the Emperor would have integrated liaisons into the project's management structure to ensure continuity, regardless of which Primarch might be in charge. A technologically adept Primarch, such as Ferrus Manus or maybe Vulcan, may have been important to the success of such a vast, complicated project which involved a great deal of Xenos technology. We can divide other roles among the Primarchs as well, based on their personalities, skills, and the roles they had already come to embody during the Great Crusade. The Emperor is grooming them for civilian and military structures leadership. Might have looked something like this. First, the obvious one, Supreme Military Command, the War Master. Obviously, it was always going to be Horus. Given his decades of experience as the Emperor's proxy and his unparalleled charisma in uniting vast military forces, it was going to be Horus. But there were alternative options. Sanguinius or Ferrus Manus, possibly. Each of the three would bring a different flavor of leadership to the role. But war isn't everything. You need civilian governance and administrative oversight. Robute Guilliman would be the natural choice here, already proven in his governance of the mini-imperium of Ultramar. His talents in organization, legal structure, and bureaucratic reform would be indispensable in running the Imperium's sprawling civil apparatus. But, as an alternative option, Perturabo's organizational genius and his ability to keep in mind both the big picture and the tiny details at the same time might have allowed him to manage the sprawling imperial bureaucracy and keep it from becoming too overgrown and inefficient. You gotta have defensive architecture and infrastructure. Rogel Dorn, with his legendary expertise in siegecraft and defense, could have been could have been assigned to ensure that the Imperium's fortifications, and by extension, installations supporting the Astronomicon and critical data and logistics networks, remained impregnable against alien advance. This would have been particularly useful during the later War of the Beast. Internal security has always been one of the Emperor's greatest concerns. The enforcement of imperial unity. A role might be carved out for a Primarch with a reputation for both ruthlessness and loyalty. Perhaps Leman Russ, or maybe a figure like Corvus Corax, whose mastery of stealth and internal operations could help prevent factional dissension. The exact candidate is subject to interpretation, given the divergent natures of the Primarchs and source material and all that, whatever. Then there's overarching coordination and crisis management. The Emperor should have envisioned a rotating chairmanship within the High Council. One of the Primarchs best suited to crisis management and inter-Primarch diplomacy might have been a good idea to serve as the collective regent in his absence. This council might have included Horus, if he's not out on the front lines doing stuff. Guilliman, Dorn, Sanguinius, these are all fine choices. You can have input from others as necessary. Such an institution might thus be less prone, let's say, to fall into disrepute and ineffectiveness, like what plagued the High Lords of Terra in the lead up to the War of the Beast against the Orcs millennia hence. Really what the Imperium needed, was institutional safeguards, so that things could keep running after his death. To truly prevent civil war and ensure continuity, the Emperor would have needed to legally or maybe psychically bind the Primarchs, introduce oaths and edicts, rituals that made any rebellion or deviation from the established chain of command not only treasonous, but sacrilegious, or at least secular sacrilegion. A crime against the Emperor's vision. By having early integration of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or by then Mechanicum, and the Custodes, you could ensure that the key institutions, the Mechanicum for the technology and the Custodians for the Praetorian security, would be interwoven into this governance framework so that no one Primarch could simply usurp power without facing coordinated resistance. Remember what happened with Vandyre millennia later. If you have some redundancies built into every critical system, notably Astronomicon, the Webway Project, the Imperial Navy, then failure or fall of one Primarch would not necessarily trigger a cascading collapse of imperial authority. It would be a crisis, and then they would move on past it. In conclusion, I feel that this counterfactual scenario, the Emperor's preparations would have centered on establishing a distributed, unified, and redundant government structure, one that could absorb his loss without fracturing the Imperium. Horus's long-standing role as War Master would serve as the foundation for military continuity. Rabute Guilliman's administrative genius could have managed civil affairs. Rogel Dorn's defensive expertise, Sanguinius's leadership, and cautiously, Magnus the Red's psychic insight might have been able to fill the remaining vital roles which had been filled by the Emperor, and each could be balanced by institutional safeguards and the collective authority of a High Council. By delineating these roles well in advance and creating a robust, oath-bound chain of command, the Emperor might have, in theory, forestalled the descent into civil war and maintained the Imperium's key assets, the Astronomicon and the Webway Project, even in the face of his own death. The big problem, then, was that the Emperor just never imagined that things could continue past his own death. He did no such thing and never seriously considered his own mortality. let it not be said that the emperor lacked for hubris. The emperor's absolute refusal to plan for his own death is one of the defining flaws of his rule and his character, an almost Shakespearean level of hubris that ultimately doomed the Imperium to stagnation, decay, and endless war. He had 20 demigods, a galaxy-spanning empire, and the most powerful military force since the Dark Age of technology. Yet he never put in place a contingency plan for his own demise. His failure was not just an oversight, it was a fundamental feature of his mindset. The emperor saw himself as irreplaceable, not just in power, but in purpose. His long-term vision, the Webway Project, the eradication of chaos, the enforced secularism of the Imperium, depended entirely on his continued existence, and if he died, everything would fail. So he chose to operate as if his death were impossible. This is, of course, an absurd assumption for someone who had fought on battlefields for thousands of years and been wounded several times. He had seen powerful beings, immortal and godlike in their own right, fall to treachery, misfortune, or overwhelming enemy force, and yet he did not create a functional governing system that could persist beyond him. Instead, he micromanaged the Imperium, concentrated power into his own hands, and relied on force of will to hold everything together. He rejected worship, despite knowing that faith in his divinity could have given the Imperium a psychological anchor after his death. And then, of course, the irony is that the Imperium did turn him into a god after he was entombed on the Golden Throne. It's just in the most dysfunctional, self-destructive way available. If the emperor had spent even a fraction of his time building institutional stability, instead of assuming that he'd always be around, the Imperium might have endured as something other than a brutal, decaying theocracy. But he didn't, because ultimately, the emperor never thought he could lose, and that is why he did lose. Onto the Primarchs. The emperor's first contact with a Primarch was not with Horus, but rather with the fetal Magnus while still gestating on Terra. With precocious and immense psychic ability, Magnus reached out to communicate with his father, reminiscent of Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. This was the first time the emperor had contact with one of his sons. Magnus reaching out to him, earnestly searching for his father. If you don't care about someone, it shouldn't take much effort to avoid having your judgment clouded by emotional connection to them. Whereas if you find that your first reaction is to care for them so much, then you may find yourself putting a lot of effort into avoiding an emotional connection. With everything we know about the emperor's refusal to engage emotionally with his sons, can we expect that he may have purposefully formed such a hard emotional shell in response to his own emotional response to Magnus's first contact? I think that this interpretation makes a lot of sense when we consider the emperor's character, his interactions with Magnus, and his broader relationships with the Primarchs. If the psychic connection with Magnus during his gestation was a profound and impactful emotional moment for the emperor, it's entirely plausible that the emperor, despite his vast intellect and self-control, found himself emotionally overwhelmed by the strength of the bond. This could have triggered his tendency to erect emotional barriers in response to his own deep, conflicting feelings. I'd like to explore this idea more deeply. So let's look at the emperor's initial emotional reaction to Magnus. First, awe and pride. Magnus was a stunning success in the emperor's genetic project, possessing unparalleled psychic power and the intelligence to match it, even while not yet born. During their psychic connection, the Emperor may have felt something close to parental pride, a recognition that Magnus was perhaps his most perfect creation. The purity and intensity of Magnus's psychic mind may have resonated deeply with the Emperor, who had long been isolated in his own power and understanding. He may have felt fear and doubt. At the same time, Magnus's sheer potential and power may have triggered the Emperor's fear of losing control. The Emperor likely recognized the immense danger Magnus could pose if his psychic abilities were misused or corrupted. This fear might have been amplified by the Emperor's own knowledge of the warp, which he had long sought to shield humanity from. Emotional vulnerability. Unlike the other Primarchs, Magnus's psychic connection allowed him to reach the Emperor on a deeply personal level, bypassing the Emperor's usual detachment. This level of connection may have been unsettling for the Emperor, who had spent millennia suppressing his emotions to maintain focus on his grand plans, as evinced by his very small cohort of perpetuals he had as friends at the time. Friends could be a bit of a misnomer there. Anyway, Magnus's bond with him might have stirred feelings of love, pride, and fear that the Emperor had not experienced in a long time, and perhaps had actively avoided. And so the Emperor made an emotional shell as a response. If the Emperor's reaction to Magnus was unusually intense, it makes sense that he would respond by shutting down emotionally to regain control. This pattern aligns with how he behaved towards the other Primarchs, as well as his broader reluctance to engage with them as individuals. The Emperor was trying to protect himself. He may have realized that his emotional investment in Magnus could cloud his judgment or make him vulnerable. By forming an emotional shell, he could maintain the objectivity and detachment he felt were necessary to manage the Primarchs and the Imperium. His refusal to engage emotionally may not have been due to indifference, but rather a reaction to caring so much and fearing the consequences of that attachment. He may have been attempting to protect Magnus. The Emperor's fear of losing Magnus to the dangers of the warp may have driven him to distance himself emotionally, believing this would keep Magnus focused and disciplined. He may have thought that maintaining a strictly authoritative relationship would prevent Magnus from becoming overconfident or reckless. Ironically, this emotional distance likely exacerbated Magnus's feelings of isolation and his eventual fall. We can see a broader pattern here. If the Emperor formed his emotional shell in response to Magnus, this could explain his distant relationships with other Primarchs. Magnus may have been the first son to breach the Emperor's emotional defenses, leading him to reinforce those defenses when he met the rest of the Primarchs. This would add tragic weight to the Emperor's emotional detachment, as it was born not of indifference, but of a desire to protect himself and his plans from his own feelings. And so we have the tragedy of miscommunication. The Emperor's emotional shell not only affected his relationship with Magnus, but also contributed to the misunderstandings and missteps that defined their tragic story. Magnus's perception. Magnus may have interpreted the Emperor's emotional distance as a sign of disapproval or rejection, fueling his desire to prove himself. This misunderstanding may have been part of what drove Magnus to overreach, leading to catastrophic consequences, such as his attempt to use sorcery to warn the Emperor about Horus. The Emperor's blind spot. By emotionally distancing himself, the Emperor failed to recognize and address Magnus's emotional needs. This will be a recurring theme throughout the whole series with a bunch of different Primarchs. He underestimated how much Magnus craved his approval and valued his connection to the Emperor, thus leaving Magnus vulnerable to feelings of isolation and desperation. This made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Emperor's fears about Magnus becoming a danger or a liability were ultimately realized, but his emotional detachment from Magnus likely played a role in creating the very circumstances he sought to avoid. Had the Emperor been more open with Magnus, he might have been able to guide him away from the path that led to the burning of Prospero and Magnus's fall to chaos. There are narrative and thematic implications we should consider. The cost of suppressing emotion. The Emperor's refusal to engage emotionally with Magnus highlights the cost of suppressing emotion in the name of what he thought was logic and control. It suggests that emotional connection is not a weakness, but a necessary part of leadership and interpersonal relationships. Magnus can be seen perhaps as a mirror of the Emperor. Magnus's story mirrors the Emperor's own struggles with pride, hubris, and emotional suppression. Both figures sought to control the warp and their own emotions, only to find that denial and distance led to greater harm. And so they had a tragic bond. The psychic connection between Magnus and the Emperor, established during Magnus's gestation, makes their story that much more tragic. They began with a profound bond of understanding, only for that bond to be later shattered by miscommunication, fear, and mistrust. And so we see a fragile bond doomed to break. The Emperor's initial psychic connection with Magnus likely, I'd say almost certainly, stirred powerful emotions that he sought to suppress, leading to the formation of an emotional shell that would define his interactions with all of the Primarchs. This refusal to engage emotionally, while intended to maintain control, ultimately contributed to Magnus's fall and the broader tragedy of the Horus heresy. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, mistrust, and emotional detachment, even in the face of immense power. What literary figures might we use for comparison to the Emperor here, finding themselves experiencing emotions of parental love, protectiveness, and vulnerability upon the birth of their first child, and turning away from those feelings? The Emperor's response to Magnus, a mixture of parental love, awe, protectiveness, and vulnerability, followed by a turning away from those feelings for fear of their consequences, finds resonance in several literary figures. These characters are often great creators or rulers caught between their responsibilities to their creations or offspring and the emotional turmoil that some connections bring. First, the obvious one, Victor Frankenstein from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There are plenty of parallels to the Emperor. Like the Emperor, Victor Frankenstein creates a being of immense potential, but his initial awe and affection turn to fear and rejection when he sees the power and danger his creation represents. Victor's inability to reconcile his emotional responsibility as a creator with his fear of losing control, mirrors the Emperor's distancing himself from Magnus despite their psychic bond. Both figures fail to engage emotionally with their creations, leading to tragedy and rebellion. Though there are some key differences, the Emperor does not reject Magnus outright, as Victor does with the creature, but his emotional detachment stems from a similar fear of what Magnus might become. The Emperor, unlike Victor, seeks to control his creation rather than abandon it entirely, but the outcome of isolation is comparable. We might look at Odin from Norse mythology. There are some parallels to the Emperor to be seen. Odin, the All-Father of Norse mythology, often shows an emotionally distant and manipulative parenting style, particularly with Loki. Odin both admires and fears Loki's intelligence and cunning, but his inability to engage with Loki emotionally leads to miscommunication, betrayal, and tragedy. Similarly, the Emperor's fear of Magnus's psychic potential and his detachment create a rift that paves the way for Magnus's fall. We might look at the place of symbolism, of knowledge and power in these stories. Like the Emperor, Odin is a figure of immense knowledge and foresight, but his fear of losing control over his children often leads him to suppress or isolate them. Both figures reflect the tension between love and control when dealing with particularly capable children. We might look at Prospero from Shakespeare's The Tempest. There are some quite important parallels to the Emperor. Prospero, a magician of immense power, parallels the Emperor in his desire to shape and control those under his care, particularly his daughter Miranda and the island spirit Ariel. His relationship with Miranda reflects a protective yet distant fatherhood, and he carefully limits her knowledge and freedom out of fear for her safety. Similarly, the Emperor keeps his sons, particularly Magnus, at a distance, fearing the consequences of too much freedom or trust or knowledge of the enemy. Like Prospero, the Emperor had a desire for control and manipulation. They both wanted to maintain absolute control, and that led to emotional suppression and missed opportunities for a deeper, genuine connection. Both figures struggle to balance their love for their creations, or their offspring, with their desire to shape them into tools of their will. Zeus, from Greek mythology, rather than the Disney version of Greek mythology, has plenty of parallels to the Emperor, and this is a bad thing. Zeus, the king of the gods on Olympus, is often depicted as both a powerful father figure and a fearful ruler who preemptively seeks to control or destroy his children when he perceives them as threats. His swallowing of Metis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, to prevent her son from overthrowing him, and his eventual conflict with Athena, who ended up being born from his head, parallel the Emperor's fear of Magnus's power and the Emperor's attempts to control or suppress it. Both Zeus and the Emperor seek to avoid vulnerability by maintaining dominance and detachment. There was a missed connection between Zeus and Athena. Like the Emperor's relationship with Magnus, Zeus's relationship with Athena shows a mix of pride in her abilities and a refusal to treat her as an equal. This dynamic parallels how the Emperor admires Magnus's psychic potential, but refuses to fully trust him or engage emotionally. All right, let's talk about the big one. Yahweh, the one true God from the Old Testament of the Bible. Oh boy. Parallels to the Emperor. The relationship between Yahweh and Adam reflects the creator-creation bond seen between the Emperor and Magnus, particularly in its initial closeness and eventual separation and distance and rebellion. Yahweh's displeasure with Adam's disobedience mirrors the Emperor's frustration with Magnus's eventual hubris and overreach with the use of psychic powers. Both Yahweh and the Emperor impose strict rules on their creation. Okay, Yahweh imposed one rule on Adam. Whatever. Strict rules on their creations, but fail to fully explain their reasoning, leading to misunderstanding and rebellion. Some theologians have blamed Eve much more than Adam, and I think that's unfair. We're just going ahead and blaming Adam outright. This led to the fall from grace. Just as Adam's desire for knowledge led to his fall, Magnus's use of sorcery, despite the Emperor's warnings, mirrors the tragedy of overarching ambition, the paradox of creation. Giving power and intelligence to a being with free will, yet punishing them for using it, applies to both relationships. If I'm struck by lightning right now, you know exactly why. On a lighter note, there's Geppetto from The Adventures of Pinocchio. Again, the original, not Disney version. There are parallels to the Emperor. Geppetto creates Pinocchio with love and care, but is disappointed or hurt by Pinocchio's actions, which he perceives as disobedience. Similarly, the Emperor creates Magnus as a being of immense potential, but becomes disillusioned when Magnus acts outside of his expectations, despite him not giving a great reason why he has those expectations. What was Magnus supposed to do? Just take it at his word? Yeah, apparently. Longing for perfection. Both Geppetto and the Emperor see their creations as reflections of themselves and expect them to embody their ideals perfectly. When their creations fail to meet these expectations, they respond with distance or frustration, exacerbating the rift. Tywin Lannister, from A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm going to be working off of the books. I haven't seen much of the TV show. Parallels to the Emperor can be seen. Tywin Lannister, like the Emperor, is a powerful leader who values strength and control, and he cares about legacy above all else. His treatment of his children, particularly Tyrion, shows his inability to reconcile parental love with his need for control and perfection. Similarly, the Emperor's detachment from Magnus stems from his inability to balance his emotional connection with his fear of vulnerability. There's the weight of legacy in both fictional settings. Tywin Lannister's desire to shape his children into instruments of his will mirrors the Emperor's approach to the Primarchs, particularly Magnus. Both figures fail to see their offspring as individuals, viewing them instead as tools for their grand designs. And so, with these various different examples from mythology, legend, religion, and fiction, we see the creator's paradox. The Emperor's relationship with Magnus is a great example of the timeless paradox of creators and creations, the struggle between love and control, pride and fear, connection and detachment. His initial bond with Magnus, formed through their psychic connection while he wasn't even born yet, is one of awe, vulnerability, and emotional intensity. But it is this very bond that drives the Emperor to turn away and suppress his feelings. From Victor Frankenstein to Odin and Zeus, we see echoes of the Emperor in figures who create, or father, beings of immense potential, only to react with fear, mistrust, or emotional detachment when those creations threaten their sense of control. These parallels highlight the tragedy of Magnus's fall and the missed opportunities for connection that define his story. The emperor failed to connect with his sons or anyone else emotionally. It is hard to say that he struggled to do so, as that implies effort. However, we know that the emperor was capable of experiencing loss and grief, as canonical literary evidence in the Black Library shows him inscribing the names of lost custodes who fell in battle into his armor in remembrance, and later shows him pausing in a moment of sad remembrance in the hall in which the 2nd and 11th Primarchs had been executed. I don't know if anyone can say, in universe or in reality, how much of the Emperor's reluctance to engage emotionally was a result of a psychological mechanism to attempt to protect him from grief. While the Emperor's reluctance to engage emotionally is evident, whether this was a deliberate psychological mechanism for self-protection or simply a consequence of his immense intellect and purpose-driven focus is difficult to discern. His moments of grief, notably inscribing fallen custodes' names on his armor or pausing in remembrance of his lost Primarchs, demonstrate that he could feel loss deeply. However, these moments were private and understated, highlighting a profound disconnect between his internal emotions and his external actions. This brings us to the question of whether the Emperor's emotional detachment was a mechanism he was using, or was it his nature? If it was a protective mechanism against grief, if the Emperor's detachment was a psychological defense, it would make some sense in light of his unparalleled burden. As the guiding force of humanity's survival, he faced losses on a scale unimaginable to others, from the deaths of billions in wars and exterminatus actions to the irretrievable damage done to humanity's potential anytime they failed to get an STC. Connecting emotionally with each loss could have rendered him unable to fulfill his grand vision, unwilling to go on, thus forcing him to compartmentalize grief to maintain focus. If it was a function of his immense perspective, the Emperor's detachment may not have been an active choice, but rather a natural result of his godlike status. To someone who can see the grand tapestry of human history and the potential futures through psychic means, individual tragedies may seem insignificant, even while being personally painful. This expansive view might have caused him to see emotional bonds as distractions or vulnerabilities, leading to his inability or unwillingness to connect deeply with his sons. It's possible the Emperor viewed emotional connections as liabilities, not for himself, but for his greater purpose. By remaining aloof, he could ensure his focus stayed on uniting humanity and securing its survival, rather than being clouded by personal attachments. The Emperor's emotional distance created a fundamental disconnect between him and his sons. The Primarchs, despite their superhuman nature, were deeply shaped by the environments where they grew up, and most of them craved some level of emotional validation or connection. The Emperor's inability or refusal to provide this often left them feeling isolated or unvalued, which contributed to many of their eventual rebellions or emotional fractures. Lionel Johnson, his isolation as a child in the woods may have predisposed him to feel the Emperor's emotional distance more acutely, reinforcing his own stoicism and self-reliance. Angron, the Emperor's refusal to understand or alleviate his suffering and need for brotherhood drove Angron to despair and hatred more surely than anything could have. Sanguinius, while the Emperor's respect for Sanguinius was apparent, the lack of personal connection left Sanguinius vulnerable to the manipulations of others who could exploit his need for validation. It's lucky that he didn't fall. Fulgrim, craving perfection and approval, Fulgrim may have seen the Emperor's detachment as a rejection, driving him to seek validation elsewhere. There's a lingering question, then. In-universe, characters may speculate whether the Emperor's emotional detachment was self-imposed or intrinsic to his nature. However, for those around him, Primarchs, Custodes, even mortals, this distinction may not matter. What they experienced was an unbridgeable emotional gulf that, while perhaps necessary for his role as humanity's savior, left many of his sons feeling abandoned or misunderstood. In reality, the Emperor's detachment serves as a powerful narrative device, emphasizing the tragic irony of a being who could create demigods and reshape the galaxy, but could not provide the emotional support his sons needed to thrive. I have a theory for why the Emperor did not put work into engaging with the Primarch's emotional needs and never bonded with them as a father to sons. When he went to Molech and passed through its warp portal to bargain with the powers of chaos, there has always lingered a question of whether he gave them anything in return. My theory is that one or more of the powers of chaos tricked the Emperor into giving up some portion of his ability to empathize and engage with people emotionally. It may even have been presented to him as a gift, something along the lines of the clarity of will to always do what needs to be done, or removing the weakness of emotional vulnerability, or some such. This sort of poisonous present would be right in Tzeentch's wheelhouse. There's a reason why gift means poison. By tricking him in this manner, they set the stage for him to be unable to identify the emotional needs of the Primarchs, or even to see the importance of such emotional needs. There's no other way to explain his actions with Angron. Or maybe there is. We'll deal with that in another video. There are some strengths and thematic appeal to this fan theory. There's great alignment with Tzeentch's methods. Tzeentch, the chaos god of change, manipulation, and deception, is known for offering gifts that, on the surface, appear to enhance clarity or power, but ultimately come at a heavy personal or spiritual cost. This is stated outright in the book Grey Knights by Ben Counter. Presenting an empathy nullifier as a boon, something that promises the Emperor unwavering clarity of will and the elimination of perceived emotional weakness, is entirely in Tzeentch's modus operandi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It fits the theme of a poisonous present, one that makes the recipient improve, but at a cost of what they already had, perhaps the cost of vital human qualities. This gives some explanatory power for the Emperor's detachment. The Emperor's notorious lack of warmth and the persistent failure to bond with his Primarchs, and by extension, to understand their emotional needs, has long been a subject of speculation. If he lost a portion of his emotional capacity through a chaos bargain, that might explain why he appeared so cold and pragmatic, almost as if he had sacrificed a part of his humanity in order to pursue his grand design, not just symbolically, but literally. This loss of empathy could have contributed to his later decisions, including his reliance on purely rational and martial methods, and his inability to nurture a cohesive, emotionally united family of Primarchs. This has narrative and symbolic parallels. The concept that the Emperor might have been cursed with emotional detachment echoes broader themes in the setting. A ruler who sacrifices personal connection for the sake of order and efficiency, yet whose inability to care ultimately contributes to the Imperium's spiritual decay. It provides a potent counterpoint to the more human qualities seen in some of his sons, qualities that, if nurtured, might have prevented some of the catastrophic schisms of the Horus heresy. There are potential gaps and questions in my theory. First, canonical evidence and interpretive challenges. There is sparse, ambiguous canon regarding what happened at Molech. Some sources allude to the emperor's contract with the powers of chaos, but the details are notoriously sketchy and controversial. This idea that he traded away part of his empathic capacity is not explicitly stated in canonical texts, so it relies heavily on interpretation and extrapolation. There are alternative explanations for his detachment. The emperor is often portrayed as naturally detached, a being whose immense intellect and psychic prowess might inherently separate him from ordinary human emotionality. It may be argued that his inability to connect with his sons was intrinsic rather than the result of a bargain. In other words, the theory must contend with the possibility that he was never designed to be overtly empathetic. Then there's the question of the nature and reversibility of the gift. Was this an irreversible loss or temporary condition? If the emperor truly lost a fundamental aspect of his emotional makeup, is there any indication that this condition could ever be reversed? Some interpretations might suggest that a bargain with chaos leaves a permanent scar, while others leave room for redemption. So this is a question that remains open in my theory. Then there's the question of the impact on the emperor's decision-making. How directly does this hypothesized loss of empathy translate into specific decisions regarding the Primarchs? Could it fully account for his inability to nurture, or might other factors, such as personal ambition, philosophical commitments, or the pressures of war, also have played a role? There are implications for the Imperium's later evolution. If the Emperor's emotional detachment was the result of a chaos bargain, we might expect wider cultural fallout, with that flaw echoing throughout imperial institutions. This might explain not only his inability to bond with his sons, but also the pervasive spiritual decay and administrative impersonality seen in the post-heresy Imperium. Remember the idea of the Fisher King. There's interaction with other elements as well. How would this lack of empathy affect his relationship with key figures like Malcador, the Custodes, or the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum? How would it influence the development of institutions like the Inquisition? Integrating this element into the broader narrative could strengthen the theory, but also complicate it. In conclusion, my theory offers a rich thematic explanation for many of the emotional and organizational deficiencies seen in the Imperium. It aligns well with Tzeentch's known methods, and it provides a narrative rationale for the Emperor's detached leadership style. At the same time, though, my theory must contend with the inherent ambiguity of canonical sources, the possibility that the emperor was naturally predisposed to emotional detachment, and questions about reversibility and the broader consequences of such a bargain with the Chaos Gods. Who knows, man? When we discuss the forgotten Primarch of the Second Legion, we shall discuss the possibility of a Xenorite Primarch in greater detail. For now, let us just presume that Primarchs such as Ferrus Manus may not have come to such a hateful and rejecting outlook on Xenos and Xenotech entirely on their own, and instead may have been specifically warned about it by the Emperor. In that case, why was the Emperor so open about the dangers of the Xenos, but also so secretive about the dangers of chaos and the warp? The Emperor's openness about the dangers of Xenos and secrecy regarding chaos and the warp is one of the most debated aspects of his strategy during the Great Crusade, with everyone more or less saying, hey, wow, what was up with that? This dichotomy reflects his calculated priorities, philosophical outlook, and manipulative approach to his Primarchs and to the Imperium as a whole. Examining this reveals much about the emperor's intentions, assumptions, and mistakes, as well as the fragility of the imperial truth. First, there's the emperor's openness about Xenos. Xenos were a tangible, immediate, physical danger that was straightforward to understand and combat. Their fleets, armies, and technology were visible, comprehensible threats which could be shot at, thus making them a natural focus for the Great Crusade. The Emperor certainly believed that humanity's survival and dominance required eradicating these external rivals, ensuring that humanity could stand alone as the supreme monodominant species of the galaxy. The Emperor used Xenos as a unifying foe for the nascent Imperium. By presenting alien species as the ultimate other, he reinforced the sense of shared identity and purpose among humanity. This approach was practical. It gave the Primarchs and their legions an easy, identifiable enemy to rally against, channeling their energies into conquest and expansion. It was also a philosophical statement. The Emperor's anti-Xenos stance was rooted in the imperial truth, which emphasized human supremacy and rationality. Xenos species were portrayed as irrational, dangerous, and ultimately inferior to humanity, reinforcing the idea that humanity alone was destined to shape the galaxy's future. By openly condemning Xenos, the Emperor established a clear moral framework that aligned with his vision of a unified, human-dominated galaxy. Why, then, was the Emperor so secretive about chaos and warp entities? Chaos was an abstract, insidious threat. Unlike the Xenos, chaos is an intangible and abstract force, existing primarily in the warp and manifesting itself through corruption, temptation, and more subtle influence. The Emperor believed that the complex and insidious nature of chaos made it harder for most people, including his Primarchs, to understand and resist. Secrecy allowed him to control the narrative, minimizing the risk of widespread fear, panic, or curiosity about the warp and its dangers. And then we do know from canon he had a fear of empowering chaos through knowledge about it. He understood that belief and attention fuel chaos, and he's not the only one to understand this. Fabius Bile, in his novels, notably says that outright. By suppressing knowledge of chaos, the Emperor aimed to starve it of power and prevent it from gaining a foothold within the Imperium, as it had on many pre-imperial human worlds. This strategy does align to some extent with the metaphysics of the warp, where emotional and psychic energy feed the chaos gods. Keeping humanity focused on rationality and material concerns was an attempt to deny chaos the emotional and psychic fuel it needed to grow, and this attempt failed. The Emperor had enormous hubris and overconfidence. He believed himself to be uniquely capable of understanding and combating chaos. His secrecy may have stemmed from a combination of his arrogance, believing he could handle chaos without the Primarch's help, and paternalism, thinking the Primarchs were ill-equipped to deal with the truth. He saw chaos as a threat best handled by himself alone, underestimating its ability to infiltrate and corrupt even his own sons. There were risks of revealing chaos to the Primarchs. The Emperor feared that openly discussing chaos would make it more tempting or fascinating to certain Primarchs, creating opportunities for curiosity and experimentation. Some of his sons notably Lorgar and Magnus, were particularly vulnerable to spiritual or intellectual seduction, and he felt that knowledge of chaos might have accelerated their fall. In this, he was mistaken. Knowledge of chaos may have been the only thing able to prevent their fall. There were some practical reasons for the Emperor's secrecy. He wanted to preserve... Well, he was, in fact, preserving the illusion of control. The Emperor wanted to project an image of absolute authority and invincibility, both to his Primarchs and to the Imperium at large. Admitting to the existence of chaos would have been tantamount to acknowledging a force beyond his control, undermining the myth of his omnipotence. He wanted to maintain the imperial truth. The imperial truth was built on a foundation of materialism and rationality, rejecting superstition and religion. Revealing chaos and the warp's true nature would have contradicted this narrative, forcing the Imperium to confront the existence of metaphysical forces that defied rational explanation. He wanted to avoid division among the Primarchs. The Primarchs were diverse in temperament and beliefs, and knowledge of chaos might have divided them further. Some, like Magnus, may have sought to study and master chaos if they knew about it. Others, notably Lorgar, might have been drawn to worship it. Still others, like Russ or Dorn, may have reacted with paranoia and distrust. Why had the Emperor not told them about it even earlier? By keeping chaos a secret, the Emperor tried to preserve unity among his sons and maintain their focus on the Great Crusade. This did not work. So why was the threat of the Xenos different? The Emperor's openness about the dangers of Xenos and his secrecy about chaos reflect his differentiated approach to threats. Xenos were externally visible. They were a concrete, external enemy that could be shot at. They could be fought and defeated through conventional warfare, even if they had psychic powers. Discussing the dangers of Xenos was safe and productive, as it reinforced the Imperium's mission without introducing unnecessary complexity or fear. Chaos, meanwhile, was internally subversive. Chaos was a hidden, internal threat that could infiltrate the Imperium and corrupt its leaders. Discussing chaos openly risked creating vulnerabilities, as knowledge of the warp might tempt individuals to explore it further. Unlike Xenos, chaos could not be defeated through military force alone. If you shoot a demon, it just goes back to the warp. This made it a far more insidious existential danger. So this brings us to the obvious question. Was the Emperor's approach a mistake? In hindsight, with the knowledge that we have from outside of the universe, the Emperor's secrecy about chaos was maybe his first or second greatest mistake. It contributed to the Horus heresy and the fall of many of his sons. By withholding knowledge of chaos from those who were most vulnerable to it, the Emperor left his Primarchs ill-equipped to recognize or resist its influence. Primarchs Lorgar, Magnus, and Fulgrim specifically fell to chaos in large part because they lacked the context or guidance needed to understand its dangers. The Emperor's secrecy also bred resentment and distrust among the Primarchs, particularly those who valued knowledge and understanding, notably Magnus. This lack of trust weakened the bonds between the Emperor and his sons, making them more vulnerable to Chaos's manipulations. I don't mean this just for the Primarchs who fell to Chaos. Sanguinius would have had a better time of fighting against the daemons of corn at Cygnus if he had known more. The emperor's hubris led him to underestimate Chaos's ability to corrupt even the emperor's own creations. By focusing on Xenos as the primary threat, he misjudged the true nature of the warp and the danger it posed to the Imperium's unity. The Emperor's openness about Xenos and secrecy about Chaos reflect his strategic priorities and philosophical assumptions. While Xenos were a tangible external enemy that reinforced the Imperium's unity, Chaos was an intangible internal threat that the Emperor sought to suppress through secrecy and control. This approach was consistent with his expediency and hubris, but it ultimately left the Primarchs and the Imperium vulnerable to the very forces he sought to conceal. The Emperor knew the dangers of Chaos better than anyone, having bargained with them directly through the warp portal at Molech. He knew exactly how dangerous Chaos was, and proceeded to warn nobody. The Emperor could have, instead, adopted the guiding principle that Primarchs who are the most vulnerable to a thing need to be taught the most about that thing in order to prepare and arm them. There are any number of metaphors we could use to justify this point, such as vaccination. But we do not even need to resort to such logical arguments because there is a deeper emotional argument. If the Emperor had allowed himself to feel his natural paternal love, feelings of emotional attachment, and protectiveness towards his sons, then he would have naturally arrived at a similar conclusion about warning his sons because he would have worried about his sons' well-being. This strikes at the heart of the Emperor's greatest failing as a father: his refusal to embrace the natural feelings of love, protectiveness, and attachment that he likely felt towards his sons, but purposely suppressed. The idea that the Primarchs most vulnerable to a specific danger should have been the ones most thoroughly prepared against that danger is not only logical, but also intuitively correct from a paternal perspective. Let us explore this argument further by examining the Emperor's emotional detachments, the consequences of his suppression of paternal instincts, and how a more empathetic approach might have changed the fates of Primarchs, like Magnus and Lorgar. So the Emperor's emotional detachment. First, you got to have a discussion about the suppression of his natural paternal love. The Emperor, despite being the creator and genetic progenitor of the Primarchs, deliberately distanced himself from fatherly attachment. He viewed emotional bonds as liabilities, fearing that love or protectiveness might cloud his judgment or cloud the judgment of his sons, or interfere with his grand plan for the galaxy. By suppressing these feelings, the Emperor reduced his sons to tools and extensions of his will, rather than treating them as individuals with individual emotional needs. There's a substantial flaw in his pragmatism, his expedient approach. The Emperor's approach was deeply pragmatic, focused on what he believed was necessary for the success of the Imperial project at the expense of pretty much anything else. However, this expediency failed to account for the emotional realities of his sons, many of whom were desperate for validation, understanding, and connection. His refusal to engage emotionally left the Primarchs vulnerable to external influences like chaos, which offered the emotional communication and validation which the Emperor withheld. We can see the obvious emotional argument, a father's natural instinct. Anyone with a child wants to protect the vulnerable. A loving father naturally seeks to protect their children's vulnerabilities, not necessarily by sheltering them, but by preparing them for the dangers they are likely to face. For Magnus, this might have meant explicit warnings and education about the Chaos Gods and the dangers of overreaching in the warp. For Lorgar, this might have meant guidance on faith and spirituality, helping him to channel his beliefs in a constructive way rather than suppressing them entirely. If the Emperor had embraced his paternal love, he might have seen that each of his sons needed individualized guidance based on their strengths and weaknesses. We might also see emotional connection as a shield. Emotional attachment would have created a foundation of trust and loyalty between the Emperor and his sons. If Magnus or Lorgar, as examples, had felt truly understood and valued as individuals, they might have been more likely to seek their father's counsel when faced with difficult choices. Chaos preys on emotional wounds and unmet needs, so a strong emotional bond with the Emperor might have acted as a bulwark against corruption. This brings us to the guiding principle of preparing those who are vulnerable with information about what they're vulnerable to. Magnus and the Warp. Magnus was the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, the second most powerful psyker in the Imperium, but this also made him the most vulnerable to the dangers of the Warp and the entities that lived in it, if that can be called life. The Emperor's refusal to share the truth about the Chaos Gods and the realms of chaos being very dangerous left Magnus overconfident and unprepared, setting the stage for his fall. If the Emperor had embraced his paternal instincts instead of putting them down and away from him, he might have recognized Magnus's vulnerability and provided him with the knowledge and tools to navigate the warp safely. Lorgar, meanwhile, was vulnerable to faith. Lorgar's deep spirituality and need for purpose made him uniquely vulnerable to the influence of chaos, maybe even more so than Magnus. Instead of condemning Lorgar's faith and burning Monarchia, the Emperor could have guided him towards a constructive understanding of faith, teaching him how to reconcile spirituality with the secular imperial truth. Believe in humanity, not demons. A fatherly approach rooted in empathy and understanding might have helped Lorgar channel his beliefs into strengthening the Imperium rather than turning against it. And then perhaps the most painful example, Angron and the butcher's nails. Angron's butcher's nails causing him continuous terrible pain, and his experience as a slave gladiator left him emotionally shattered and consumed by rage and an unmet need to protect his brothers. Rather than forcing Angron into a leadership role he was unprepared for and unsuited for, the Emperor could have acknowledged his pain and sought a way to heal or at least manage his trauma first. This would have required the Emperor to act out of compassion rather than cold expediency, but it might have given Angron a chance at redemption and long-term service to the Imperium. Ultimately, this brings us to the main thematic implication of the tragedy of the Emperor. The consequences of his emotional suppression are horrible. The Emperor's suppression of his internal instincts, though, reflects a broader theme in Warhammer 40,000. The cost of emotional detachment. By refusing to engage with his sons on an emotional level, the Emperor inadvertently created the conditions for their rebellion. This makes him a tragic figure, as his greatest strength, his pragmatism, and laser focus on the grand vision for the future, was also his greatest weakness. Chaos, then, serves as a perverse and corrupted substitute that fills the ecological niche. Chaos exploits the emotional void left by the Emperor, offering the Primarchs the connection and understanding they craved. Magnus's fall to Tzeentch, Lorgar's embrace of chaos as a divine force, and Perturabo's embrace of chaos as a source of strength can all be traced back to unmet emotional needs that the Emperor failed to address, sometimes that the Emperor exacerbated. The tragedy is that chaos did not create these vulnerabilities. It merely took advantage of what the Emperor left unfixed. What could the Emperor have done differently? Well, basically anything. He could have done anything instead of nothing. Maybe he could have given them individual guidance. He could have tailored his mentorship to each Primarch, teaching them what they needed to know to overcome their vulnerabilities. Heck, he could have given some mentorship to each Primarch instead of putting Conrad Kurz in control of a legion with no anything. More specific examples. Magnus. He could have given him a deeper education about the warp and the chaos gods. He could have given Lorgar guidance on reconciling faith with a secular imperial truth. Angron needed emotional support and a focus on healing his trauma. Perturabo needed some sort of validation or acknowledgement at all. Just anything. The Emperor could have embraced emotional connection with his sons by allowing himself to feel and express his paternal love, by calling them his sons instead of tools. The Emperor could have built stronger bonds of trust with his sons. This would have made the Primarchs less susceptible to the manipulations of chaos, and more likely to seek the Emperor's counsel when faced with difficult choices. The Emperor could have acknowledged vulnerabilities in the Primarchs. He needed to recognize that the Primarchs were not infallible, and that their vulnerabilities were not weaknesses to be ignored, but challenges to be addressed, especially if he caused those weaknesses on purpose, according to some parts of canon. Preparing them for their specific vulnerabilities would have been an act of love and foresight, rather than leaving them to discover these dangers on their own like a toddler falling into a campfire. As a conclusion of this line of thinking, we see the Emperor had a blind spot in his paternal life. The Emperor's refusal to embrace his paternal instincts and prepare his sons for their vulnerabilities was a critical error, maybe the critical error, with devastating consequences. His failure to warn Magnus about the true horrors of chaos, his rejection of Lorgar's spirituality, everything stems from the same flaw, a belief that emotional connection was unnecessary for achieving his goals and maybe dangerous. Had the Emperor acted as a loving father, rather than a distant ruler, he might have strengthened his sons against the forces that ultimately corrupted half of them. Let us consider an alternate scenario for the finale of the Horus heresy aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the Gloriana-class battleship that was Horus's flagship. Sanguinius already lays dead at the hands of Horus. The Emperor arrives, but with Dorn instead of alone, and the two of them fight Horus together. During the fight, Horus has gained some advantage in the fight and strikes at Dorn with what is sure to be a killing blow. The Emperor intentionally places himself in the way, suffering a mortal injury to save Dorn, after which an enraged Dorn strikes Horus at the weak point in Horus's armor made by Sanguinius, killing him and ending the Horus heresy in roughly the same configuration as in canon. Dorn alive, Sanguinius dead, Horus dead, Emperor mortally wounded and brought to the Golden Throne. Very small change, but this alternative would have enormous implications for the Emperor's character and emotional state, as well as that of Dorn, while making a very small change to the order of certain events and not changing the eventual outcome. Despite how small this difference is, I posit to you that it could not happen. There is absolutely no way that the emperor would ever give up his own life to save one of the Primarchs. The very idea, so spectacularly human that you can nearly hear King David's cry of anguish when you read 2 Samuel 18, verse 33, is completely outside of the emperor's identity. He had long since lost, or perhaps given up, his humanity to become what he believed was necessary. In doing so, he lost his ability to connect with his children as any human father does by instinct. It's so damn tragic. The emperor could never give up his life to save one of his children, and this strikes at the heart of his character and the central tragedy of Warhammer 40,000. The emperor is a figure of immense power, vision, and superhuman ambition, but his loss of humanity, his detachment from his sons, and his inability or refusal to embrace paternal love are the threads from which his downfall and the Imperium's endless suffering are woven. Okay, let's look at this a little more in depth. Let's look at it, why it could not happen, and what it reveals about the Emperor's character and the broader tragedy of the setting. Why would the Emperor not sacrifice himself for Dorne? The Emperor's identity is inextricably tied to his detachment and grand purpose. Everything he does is in service of his grand plan to create a galaxy free from chaos and religion and Xenos, and his sons are tools. Powerful, brilliant, important tools, but tools nonetheless. He cannot afford to prioritize any individual life, even one of theirs, over the success of his plan. But then that brings us to the Emperor's view of himself. The Emperor sees himself as irreplaceable. He is the guiding hand of the Imperium, the architect of humanity's salvation, and the only being capable of holding back the tide of chaos. To risk or sacrifice his life for one of his sons would be, in his mind, a betrayal of the greater good. For the Emperor, the plan always comes first. If he died before the plan was complete, he had no backup plan. The Imperium and humanity would fall into chaos. No individual, not Dorne, not anyone, could be more important than that. The Emperor's view of his sons was that they are tools. The Primarchs are tools, extensions of the Emperor's will and nothing more. They are brilliant, powerful, and unique, but ultimately disposable. The loss of Ferrus Manus, for example, the first of the Primarchs to die, is devastating strategically, but not emotionally. He was a general lost in battle, not a beloved son. Even Horus, whom the Emperor seems to have genuinely favored, is not mourned when he falls to chaos. The Emperor focuses on stopping Horus, not saving him. This cold pragmatism underscores the Emperor's inability to act with the selfless love of a human father. With that in mind, here's what the Emperor sacrificing himself would represent. The Emperor sacrificing himself for Dorne would be a profoundly human act of love and vulnerability. It would require him to value one life above the plan, to accept that the tools he has created are not disposable, but are irreplaceable as individuals. This is antithetical to his identity as the perfect, unfeeling architect of humanity's future, and that's why it did not happen. The tragedy of the Emperor's detachment is that it made him less, not more. My comparison to King David's cry of anguish over Absalom, I hope you find to be haunting. David's lament is the archetype of paternal love and grief, a raw, unfiltered human response to the loss of a child. The Emperor, by contrast, is incapable of such a response. The tragedy lies in the fact that he has consciously chosen to sever himself from these emotions, believing they would weaken his purpose. But they weakened him by not having them. Here's what the Emperor lost. The Emperor may once have been capable of human love and connection. We see faint echoes in this in the early interactions with Magnus, Horus, and Sanguinius. But over time, he sacrificed his humanity to his vision, becoming an aloof and unrelatable figure to his sons, with Malcador his only confidant. By losing his ability to connect with the Primarchs as a father, the Emperor loses the ability to guide them emotionally. This makes him blind to their struggles and vulnerabilities, leaving them easy prey to chaos and to their own flaws. The cost of detachment here, the Emperor's refusal to engage emotionally, is that it is the root of the Primarch's rebellion. Horus falls because he feels abandoned and unloved. Magnus falls because he seeks guidance and receives none, and then flies off the handle doing his own thing. Angron, Lorgar, Perturabo, they're all driven to rebellion by unmet emotional needs that the Emperor either ignores or cannot understand. If the Emperor could have embraced his sons with the love and vulnerability of King David, perhaps he could have prevented their fall. But his detachment ensures that their tragedies and his own are inevitable, unless maybe the Primarchs could meet their emotional needs as brothers. My alternate scenario here, with the Emperor saving Dorne and then Dorne killing Horus, is emotionally powerful precisely because it is impossible. It represents an emperor who has not lost his humanity, who values his sons as individuals, and who is willing to sacrifice himself for their sake. But this is not the God Emperor of humanity of Warhammer 40,000. And so we see the emperor that might have been, the humanity that might have been. The emperor stepping in to save Dorne, showing that he loves his sons as individuals, not just as tools, would make him vulnerable, fallible, and human. This would be the moment of connection that would redefine his relationship with the surviving Primarchs, and thus with humanity overall. Such an act would bring in an echo of the biblical parable of the Good Shepherd. It would transform the emperor from a cold, calculating figure into a truly sacrificial leader, willing to die for his children and his people. With the Fisher King, that means that it would transform the Imperium. The fact that this scenario could not happen is the core tragedy of Warhammer 40,000. It underscores that the Emperor's refusal to be a father, his inability to connect with his sons, and the prioritization of the plan over the love and humanity are what drove the galaxy into eternal darkness. This is the profound irony of the setting. The Emperor, who sought to create an utopia free from superstition and suffering, is the architect of the Imperium's unending tyranny and despair. In conclusion, the Emperor placing himself in harm's way to save Dorne would have been an act of redemptive love, one that could have altered the course of the Imperium and the fates of the surviving Primarchs. But it is ultimately impossible for the Emperor as we know him. His fundamental refusal to embrace his sons, like how King David mourned Absalom, or as the Good Shepherd sought the lost sheep, is the defining tragedy of Warhammer 40,000. This inability to connect is what makes him a tragic figure and ensures the galaxy's descent into darkness. The Emperor's choice to sacrifice his humanity for his vision is the original sin of the Imperium. and its consequences echo through every corner of the setting. The Emperor did not lead the Istvan V campaign. The Emperor did not go to Angron to sanction him. The Emperor went to Monarchia to sanction Lorgar, but he had Malcador lead the effort and only showed up personally when Malcador's authority was insufficient to overawe Lorgar. The Emperor went to great lengths to have Leman Russ as an intermediary between himself and various Primarchs and legions when he needed his will enforced, notably the World Eaters, the 2nd Legion, and the 11th Legion. I feel that we have enough evidence to support the idea that the Emperor was trying to shield himself from grief by preventing himself from having direct responsibility for punishing and harming his sons, the Primarchs, in addition to his attempts to distance himself from the Primarchs by telling Malcador that he does not call them his sons. The Emperor's actions suggest a deliberate attempt to create layers of separation between himself and the Primarchs, especially in situations where punishment or confrontation was required. This distancing seems to align with a psychological mechanism to shield himself from emotional pain, particularly grief or guilt, over harming those that he created. I feel that we have some evidence to support the idea of the Emperor's emotional shielding. Delegation of punitive actions. Istvan V. The Emperor did not personally lead the campaign against the traitors. Instead, he relied on loyalist Primarchs to carry out his will. Sanctioning Angron. The Emperor avoided personal involvement, allowing Angron's rebellion and subsequent struggles to unfold without direct intervention. He just sent the Space Wolves after them. At Monarchia, even when sanctioning Lorgar, the Emperor only made a personal appearance when Malcador and Guilliman's presence proved insufficient, emphasizing his reluctance to directly confront his sons. And then Leman Russ as enforcer. By positioning Russ as his executioner, the Emperor created a buffer between himself and the emotional weight of sanctioning the Primarchs. And so we have a denial of fatherhood that comes in. The Emperor is saying to Malcador that he does not call the Primarchs his sons, reflects his attempt to redefine his relationship with them in a more impersonal, hierarchical manner. This distancing language aligns with a broader pattern of emotional detachment, likely an effort to avoid the vulnerabilities inherent in familial bonds. And then the indirect conflict with Horus. We'll explore the duel with Horus in depth later, but the Emperor's reluctance to act against the War Master earlier in the heresy, which, remember, lasted 7 years, despite mounting evidence, suggests that he struggled to confront the emotional reality of Horus's betrayal. This gives us implications of the Emperor's detachment protecting him from grief. The Emperor's actions indicate a clear effort to insulate himself from the emotional burden of harming or punishing the Primarchs. By delegating these responsibilities as best he could maintain his focus on the larger goal of unifying humanity without being overwhelmed by personal grief. This distancing, while protective for the Emperor in an unhealthy way, exacerbated the feelings of abandonment or misunderstanding among the Primarchs. Many of them sought his approval or connection, and his refusal to engage emotionally left them vulnerable to feelings of resentment or inadequacy. And so this is the tragic flaw. The Emperor's reluctance to embrace his role as a father figure is his most significant failure. While his detachment may have been intended to protect himself and his broad, grand vision for humanity, it ultimately contributed to the fracturing of his sons and the Imperium. The Emperor's attempts to shield himself from grief by delegating punitive actions and denying emotional connections demonstrates his struggle with the consequences of his godlike responsibilities. However, his failure to engage with the emotional needs of his primarchs, while understandable given his burdens, underscore the tragic irony of his character. The measures he took to protect himself and his vision sowed the seeds of the heresy and the eventual downfall of his grand design. But this leads us to wonder, do the emperor's attempts to shield himself from grief by delegating punitive actions and denying emotional connections inform us regarding his insistence that the Primarchs were tools rather than people? Does it give us a better view into how he approached newly discovered Primarchs? I believe the answer to be yes. These tendencies are emblematic of a broader pattern of emotional detachment, likely a psychological mechanism to maintain his focus on the grand vision of the Imperium, while avoiding the vulnerabilities inherent in personal relationships. The Emperor's framing of the Primarchs as tools or instruments of his will reflects a deliberate strategy to maintain emotional distance. If the Primarchs were viewed primarily as weapons or instruments of governance rather than as his sons, it would theoretically lessen the personal impact of their losses, failures, or betrayals. This detachment would allow the Emperor to focus on the Imperium as a whole, treating individual Primarchs as interchangeable tools, parts of a larger machine. However, this view was contradicted by the reality of the Primarchs as highly individualistic beings, each with complex emotions, loyalties, and needs. This fundamental disconnect between how the Emperor saw his sons and how they saw themselves sowed resentment and misunderstanding. For instance, Angron's suffering with the butcher's nails was dismissed as a problem to be tolerated in a tool that could be utilized, rather than an illness which needed to be treated and alleviated. Lorgar's spiritual devotion was rebuffed and brutally punished, rather than nurtured or redirected constructively. The Emperor's approach to newly discovered Primarchs reveals this same detachment. While he often greeted them with warmth and celebration, his underlying strategy seemed to prioritize their utility over individuality. For example, the Emperor assessed each Primarch based on their perceived strengths and immediately assigned them roles within his broader vision. Fulgrim's perfectionism, steadfast fortitude, and Lorgar's charisma were harnessed for imperial purposes, most of the time, at the expense of their personal aspirations or emotional well-being. The Emperor only rarely engaged with the emotional baggage or personal trauma that each Primarch carried. Angron's rage, Kurz's instability, and Mortarion's hatred of oppression were all acknowledged, but not really addressed. Instead, their pain was exploited as motivation for them to improve their strategic value. This approach aligns with the Emperor's larger pattern of attempting to minimize emotional vulnerability. By treating the Primarchs as tools, he shielded himself from grief. That is, if a Primarch were to die, or fail, or maybe even rebel, framing them as mere instruments of his will made it easier to compartmentalize those losses. He avoided personal accountability. By delegating punitive actions, mostly Leman Russ, the Emperor maintained a layer of abstraction between himself and the emotional consequences of those decisions. And he maintained control. Treating the Primarchs as tools reinforced the hierarchy of authority, positioning the Emperor as the ultimate impersonal arbiter of their roles and destinies. So in conclusion, the Emperor's insistence on viewing the Primarchs as tools was an attempt to create emotional insulation in the face of potential loss or betrayal. This approach, however, had significant flaws. It alienated his sons, it dismissed their emotional needs, and it contributed to the very betrayals and fractures he sought to prevent. It also reflected the emperor's own inability to reconcile his immense responsibility with his capacity for human connection, a failing that echoed throughout the Imperium's history. When it came to the Primarchs' handling of their legions, especially the genetic flaws, such as the red thirst, the flesh change, or the wolfen, the emperor was quite hands-off. Was this due to his confidence in the Primarchs? Here's another possible, more cynical political motivation. If a Primarch fails, it's because they were flawed. Sweep the problem under the rug. But if the emperor puts his full weight behind an effort and still fails, it's because the emperor is flawed. Thus, the politically safest option is for the emperor to be hands-off. This frames the emperor's decision to leave the Primarchs, especially Magnus and the Thousand Sons, largely to their own devices as a matter of self-preservation, rather than framing it as trust, hope, or emotional avoidance. Let's explore this idea a little further. We gotta look at the emperor as a political actor. While the emperor's motivations are often portrayed, especially by himself, as grand and idealistic, he was also a master manipulator and pragmatist, deeply invested in preserving his own authority and mythos. His actions often reflect a keen awareness of how his image and decisions would be perceived by others. Let's look at the implications for Magnus and the Thousand Sons. It deflects blame. By maintaining a hands-off approach, the emperor could distance himself from any potential failure. If Magnus failed to cure or manage the flesh change, or if the Thousand Sons were ultimately sanctioned, this failure would rest entirely on Magnus, not the emperor. It would preserve the emperor's image. A hands-off approach allowed the emperor to maintain his image as a perfect and infallible figure, untainted by the possibility of personal failure. By delegating responsibility to Magnus, he ensured that any fallout would not tarnish his own reputation. We have some evidence supporting this interpretation. The forgotten, the purged legions, the erasure of the 2nd and 11th legions, suggests a pattern of sweeping failures under the rug rather than confronting them directly. The emperor may have been determined to avoid another public failure, particularly so soon after those events. The Council of Nicaea. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The emperor's eventual condemnation of sorcery at Nicaea can be seen as a politically safe response to the growing mistrust of psychers. This decision, while seemingly pragmatic, also distanced the emperor from Magnus's methods and their potential consequences. And then lack of intervention, the emperor's refusal to intervene in Magnus's struggles with the flesh change, despite his immense resources and knowledge, aligns with a strategy of avoiding personal investment in situations with high potential for failure. He had emotional and political distance. The emperor's reluctance to engage emotionally with his sons can be interpreted as a political strategy designed to preserve his authority. So here's how emotional detachment serves a political purpose. It maintains hierarchy. By keeping his sons at arm's length, the emperor reinforced his position at the top of the Imperium's hierarchy, ensuring that the Primarchs remained tools rather than equals or peers. It avoided personal vulnerability. Emotional engagement with his sons would have made the emperor vulnerable to criticism and accountability. If he were seen as too attached to Magnus, for example, any failure on Magnus's part could be construed as a failure of the emperor's judgment. And then we have Magnus as a test case. Magnus, with his immense psychic potential and unorthodox methods, represented both an incredible asset and a significant risk. By leaving Magnus to handle the flesh change on his own, the emperor effectively turned him into a test case for the viability of psychic integration within the legions. If Magnus succeeds, the emperor can claim credit for his faith in Magnus. If Magnus fails, the emperor can distance himself from the fallout. But then there are risks of being hands-off. While politically safe, this hands-off approach carries significant risks, many of which came to terrible fruition in Magnus's story. It reinforced his isolation. The emperor's lack of involvement exacerbated Magnus's sense of isolation, deepening the emotional wounds that would later drive him to make reckless decisions. Magnus may have interpreted the emperor's distance as indifference or even disapproval, fueling his eventual rebellion. And then there's the undermining of the Thousand Sons' legitimacy. By not intervening to support Magnus more directly, by not giving him greater resources, the emperor allowed mistrust of the Thousand Sons to fester among the other legions. This further isolated Magnus and his sons, making them more vulnerable to manipulation by chaos. And then there's the political fallout. While the emperor may have hoped to avoid personal accountability, his failure to guide Magnus ultimately contributed to the Horus heresy, as well as the destruction of Prospero. Because of this, the emperor's hands-off approach was not politically safe at all. It was a disaster. It was catastrophic. This fits into a broader pattern of delegation. The emperor's treatment of Magnus and the Thousand Sons works right in what he did with delegation and detachment in his relationships with all the other Primarchs, pretty much. We can see some similar examples. Horus's ascendancy. The emperor entrusted Horus with the role of war master, leadership of the Great Crusade, and then left him without adequate oversight or emotional support, contributing to his eventual fall. Lorgar's religious zeal. The emperor ignored Lorgar's obvious and growing obsession with worship until it reached a breaking point, at which point he publicly humiliated Lorgar rather than addressing the root of the issue. And then, of course, there's Angron. He refused to put public effort into removing the butcher's nails from Angron. He only had Arkan Land show up and play around a little bit and say, "Nope, busted, can't do it." He effectively abandoned Angron to a lifetime of pain and fury. Of course, Magnus was also unique. Unlike some of his brothers, notably Conrad Kors, Magnus actively sought the emperor's approval and guidance. This made the emperor's detachment even more damaging, as it directly contradicted Magnus's emotional needs and reinforced his sense of abandonment. The tragic irony here is the emperor's flawed political strategy. The emperor's hands-off approach to Magnus and the Thousand Sons shows his attempt to avoid personal accountability, ultimately making him more responsible for their downfall. He was concerned with short-term political safety, which caused long-term catastrophe. In the short term, the emperor's detachment may have preserved his image as an infallible leader and avoided political controversy. In the long term, This detachment created a vacuum of guidance and trust that chaos was quick to exploit, leading to the grand tragedies of the Horus heresy. The emperor's blind spot was that by prioritizing political safety over emotional engagement, the emperor failed to recognize the emotional and psychological needs of his sons. This blind spot not only alienated Magnus, but ultimately contributed to the wider fractures that led to the Horus heresy. The idea that the emperor's political self-preservation influenced his decision to remain hands-off when Magnus or the other Primarchs were dealing with their genetic flaws in their legion is cynical, but it is very consistent with the broader narrative of the emperor's character. His detachment allowed him to avoid accountability if Magnus failed, but it ultimately undermined the very goals he sought to achieve. Had the emperor taken a more active role, he might have prevented the tragic events that followed. However, his fear of personal vulnerability and political fallout blinded him to the cost of inaction, making Magnus's fall and the destruction of the Thousand Sons both inevitable and avoidable. Maybe we should look at some real-world historical examples of leaders who did what they thought was the safe choice politically, only to have it cause a gigantic catastrophe. Well, you know me, I gotta go for the big one. Pontius Pilate, baby! So in antiquity, we find the character of Pontius Pilate, governor in the Roman Empire, 1st century CE. The decision. As the Roman governor of Judea, Pilate faced immense pressure from local religious leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and an unruly crowd during Jesus' trial. To avoid unrest and maintain what he thought would lead to political stability, Pilate condemned Jesus to crucifixion, despite his apparent doubts about Jesus' guilt. The catastrophe, far from maintaining peace, Pilate's decision contributed to the birth of Christianity, which would grow to challenge and overthrow Roman paganism, and later become a cornerstone of Western civilization. Not to mention that it may have led to further unrest in the decades following in Judea. Pilate's politically safe choice ultimately created the grounds for long-term unrest and instability that he could never have really foreseen. In the medieval period, we see Emperor Alexios Komnenos, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, of the Byzantine Empire, inviting Western help in 1095. The decision. Alexios sought military assistance from Pope Urban II to reclaim Byzantine territory which had been lost to the Seljuk Turks. He expected a small contingent of professional soldiers. But instead, there was a catastrophe. Urban launched the Crusade, what we call the First Crusade, ultimately bringing tens of thousands of unruly, independent-minded knights and peasants into Byzantine lands, barely better than bandits. This led to conflict between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, ultimately culminating in the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, permanently weakening the Byzantine Empire. And so we see that Alexios' short-term request for help to bolster his empire led to a catastrophic weakening of Byzantine sovereignty and its eventual decline. In the early modern era, we can see Emperor Jiajing and the eunuch faction in China's Ming dynasty in the 16th century. I don't know how to pronounce Jiajing. I hope I'm doing it correctly. To secure his rule and avoid political instability, Emperor Jiajing delegated substantial power to eunuchs within the imperial court, allowing them to manage state affairs and military oversight. But the eunuchs became deeply corrupt, weakening the military and the economy while alienating scholars and officials. This erosion of governance and trust contributed significantly to the eventual fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644. And so the emperor's attempt to consolidate power by relying on a safe internal faction led to long-term systemic failure. In the 20th century, of course, we have Neville Chamberlain and appeasement. United Kingdom, 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued a policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler, believing that Hitler surely doesn't want a war. So he signed the Munich Agreement and allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain believed, or at least said publicly, that this would avoid another Great War. This was a catastrophe. Rather than being satisfied, Hitler saw appeasement as a green light to continue his territorial expansion, leading to World War II. Chamberlain's efforts to avoid conflict only delayed the inevitable and gave Germany time to grow stronger. If Germany had tried to invade the rocky, mountainous territory of Czechoslovakia with his then not at its peak army, he may have had a tough time of it. That's a question for a different historian. I'm not that deep into it. The short-term political goal, though, of maintaining peace created the conditions for one of the most destructive wars in human history, certainly the most famous war. Shortly after that, we have the partition of India in 1947. Facing mounting communal tensions and political pressure from both Hindu and Muslim leaders, British authorities expedited the partition of India into two states, India and Pakistan, based largely on religious demographics. This was a catastrophe. The rushed and poorly planned partition led to widespread violence, the displacement of over 15 million people, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands at first. The border disputes it created, especially over Kashmir, continue to cause conflict today. The British saw partition as a politically safe exit strategy, but the failure to plan adequately for its consequences left a legacy of instability and suffering that now we all have to deal with. And then there's contemporary examples. Bashar al-Assad's repression of protests. I've heard his name said on the news before. I at least know how to pronounce that. Anyway, Bashar al-Assad, Syria, 2011. In response to mostly peaceful protests during the Arab Spring, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad chose to use brutal force to suppress dissent, believing it would maintain his regime's stability. But then the harsh crackdown escalated into a full-scale civil war, leading to immense human suffering, contributing to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and Syria becoming a proxy battlefield for global powers. The conflict continues to devastate the region. They'll be dealing with the fallout for generations. Bashar al-Assad's decision to prioritize short-term regime stability created a prolonged catastrophe that destabilized the broader Middle East. And then Vladimir Putin and the most recent, as of this recording, invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Slava Ukraini. Believing Ukraine would fall quickly, Putin launched a full-scale special military operation, expecting to boost his domestic popularity and reassure Russia's dominance on the global stage. Reassure, whatever. This, of course, galvanized NATO and the EU, severely damaged Russia's economy, and turned Ukraine into a long-term quagmire for Russian forces, wherein NATO and the EU could fight a proxy war against Russia. Far from enhancing Russia's power, The war isolated the country diplomatically and militarily and is in the process of destroying their economy. Putin's gamble on what he believed to be a politically safe victory to secure his legacy backfired spectacularly, undermining his regime and Russia's global standing. Ukraine stands strong as of the time I recorded this. These examples demonstrate how leaders' attempts to make politically safe choices can backfire catastrophically when they prioritize short-term stability or appearances over addressing deeper systemic issues. They also highlight the dangers of misjudging risks, underestimating opposition, or failing to plan for long-term consequences. And now it is perhaps time for some heavy speculation. You're already, like an hour into this video? You may as well stick around and listen to what I have to say. What are some possible reasons for why the Emperor never tried to create female transhumans? The Emperor is portrayed as a master geneticist capable of designing the Astartes, the Custodes, the Thunder Warriors, the Primarchs. Given his level of control over genetic engineering, the absence of female transhumans has to be a deliberate choice rather than a technical limitation. Let's discuss a few possible reasons, get a few different perspectives on this. Okay, so practical and genetic reasons. There's the stability hypothesis. The Emperor may have determined that male genetic structures were more stable for transhuman modifications, especially for large-scale projects like the Astartes and Thunder Warriors. The genetic modifications in Space Marines are already highly volatile, leading to mutations, especially in later Space Marine foundings. The Primarch project itself was corrupted despite the Emperor's best efforts. Perhaps adding female genetic variants would make the enhancements even more unstable. There's the efficiency and scalability argument. The Emperor wanted a model that could be easily replicated across billions of recruits. If a specific biological sex responded more uniformly to genetic modification, it might have been easier to mass produce an army without additional complications. The Emperor prioritized rapid expansion, and maybe he chose what was the biologically simpler path. Then there's the Custodes exception. The Custodes are individually crafted. They are bespoke, and yet they are all male as well. Since they are built from scratch rather than just recruited, there's no obvious reason for them to be gender exclusive. This suggests that the decision was deliberate, even for his elite bodyguards. Then there are social and psychological factors. The Emperor was focused on conquest, we know that. The Great Crusade was a brutal campaign designed for rapid, large-scale warfare. He may have structured his transhuman warriors around what he believed to be, what he considered to be, the most psychologically and physically suited demographic for endless war. Space Marines are recruited at the height of pubescent invincibility in young men, before they learn that they are mortal. The Emperor's understanding of human psychology may have led him to favor this for his hierarchical, male-dominated warrior culture, to foster the kind of brutal loyalty that he needed. Then, of course, the Emperor was really, really old, so he had the influence of ancient warrior cultures that he had learned from and maybe participated in. The Emperor shaped the Imperium with echoes of past warrior cultures, Rome, Sparta, the Mongols. These societies idealized male warrior elites generally, and the Emperor may have deliberately structured his forces to resemble these historical models. And then maybe he was avoiding disruptions to his vision of human society. If the emperor had created both male and female Astartes, for example. It might have led to unintended consequences for the Imperium's social structure, like Victor Frankenstein freaking out about the possibility of his monster reproducing. Did he fear that transhuman women would undermine the traditional role of human women as childbearers? Was he concerned that allowing women into transhuman ranks would disrupt the strict hierarchical and patriarchal order that he established in the Imperium and that he apparently envisioned for a post-Crusade society? This brings us to the obvious next problem: the emperor's personal views and biases. The emperor may have been sexist. It's entirely possible that the emperor, despite his incredible intelligence, carried a fundamental bias regarding gender roles. He was born in ancient times when patriarchal societies dominated in some areas of the world. If he had a subconscious belief that war was a man's domain, he may have never seriously reevaluated that belief. He may have never seriously considered female transhuman warriors. His interactions with women in lore are limited. We are specifically ignoring the terrible Inquisition War novel series, and he rarely appears to elevate them to positions of great power. The emperor had a specific vision of human perfection, and maybe for whatever reason, that vision excluded female transhumans. He might have believed that female transhumans would disrupt his ideal humanity. If he planned for the Primarchs and Astartes to eventually be phased out, like how he got rid of the Thunder Warriors, he may have wanted to keep human women untouched by transhuman enhancements to preserve human genetic purity. I don't know, man. Like, there's limited arguments besides just the emperor was sexist. Maybe the Primarch project limited his choices. If the emperor derived the Astartes from the Primarch project and the Primarchs themselves were designed in part based off of the emperor's genetics, then they were designed to be male. Then the Astartes may have been inherently locked into being male as well. I don't know. Maybe the Primarchs were modeled on the emperor himself, who was male. Maybe something about their genetic makeup made it difficult to create female derivatives without causing severe instability. That still doesn't explain the Custodes, but whatever. Then there's the question of chaos and the warp. Did the warp corrupt his original plans? The Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by chaos before they could fully mature. Could the Emperor have originally designed both male and female Primarchs, only for the Chaos powers to alter the project? If Chaos tampered with the Primarchs, it may have locked their genetic lineage into a male-only framework, preventing female transhumans from being viable. Like maybe the Emperor made the 20 Primarchs, but he'd intended to make 20 more who were female, but then the lab was destroyed by Chaos or something. I don't know, man. Did the Emperor want to minimize Chaos influence? Yeah, but like, was this the way to do it? Chaos exploits desire, emotion, interpersonal relationships, emotional weaknesses which are not met, emotional needs which are not fulfilled. Maybe the Emperor, if he were sexist, may have feared that if he created both male and female transhumans, they might form attachments or rivalries that could be exploited by Chaos. Maybe he thought that a strictly male warrior cult might have been easier to control and manipulate without emotional entanglements. If that's the case, he was just dumb. That clearly was never going to work. Then we get to probably the real reasons. The narrative and meta-textual reasons from our real reality, not from in-universe. Warhammer's origins as a male-dominated fiction. From a meta perspective, Warhammer 40,000 was created as a setting inspired by hyper-masculine war fiction and as a parody of that same fiction. The male exclusivity of the Astartes and Custodes reflects the genre's historical influences rather than an in-universe necessity. The Sisters of Battle were a later addition. Games Workshop introduced the Sisters of Battle much later, possibly as a way to address the lack of female warriors, but also maybe as a way to continue the satire and comment on how ridiculous sexism is. I don't know, man. However, the Sisters of Battle remain purely human, reinforcing the idea that transhumanism in the Imperium is male-dominated. Yeah, there's female astropaths and female navigators. Those are mutations, not specifically designed transhuman improvements. Would female transhumans disrupt the Imperium's narrative? If the Imperium had female Astartes, Custodes, or Primarchs, then the gender politics of the setting would be significantly different. The Imperium's rigid, male-centric structure would have been harder to justify. Thematically, the Emperor's failures are linked to his inability to understand or relate with human emotion and social interaction. His failure to incorporate women into his genetic projects might just be another example of his short-sightedness. And so we see this is a deliberate choice, not a technical limitation. While we can't know for sure, the in-universe explanation of the absence of female transhumans appears to be a choice made by the Emperor rather than a limitation of his abilities. Whether due to genetics, practicalities, his social biases, personal biases, or the actions of chaos, the Emperor's decision shaped the Imperium in fundamental ways. Out of universe, the decisions made by the people designing the Warhammer 40,000 setting made commentary on sexism an important part of the setting by not having female transhumans. Make of that what you will. Make your own darn video. Some of the Emperor's sons, his Primarchs, had moments in which extreme emotions may have allowed them to gain emotional insight into their father, the Emperor. I see some possibilities. This is probably not an exhaustive list. You should make your own darn video. First, Rogel Dorn. He shared in the feeling of failure of the Imperial dream. At the climax of the Siege of Terra, aboard the Spirit of Vengeance, Dorn is confronted with the Emperor's broken, dying body and the shattered dream of the Imperium. In this moment, the burden of the Emperor's ambition and the cost of its failure became starkly apparent. Here's the possible insight. Dorn may have realized that the Emperor's detachment and pragmatism were not born just of indifference, but of an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The failure of the dream and the betrayal of Horus mirrored the Emperor's struggles to unite humanity at any cost. Sharing this loss may have allowed Dorn to understand his father's profound loneliness and the weight of leading a species that so often failed him. Then we have Lionel Johnson, the great loss under his care. The losses suffered during the Rangdan genocides would have deeply affected Lionel Johnson. This, combined with the isolation he often felt since childhood, might have created a parallel to the Emperor's own struggles as a ruler disconnected from those he led. Lionel Johnson may have seen the Emperor's distance not as coldness, but as a survival mechanism, a way to endure when those under one's care are so often lost in service to a greater ideal. This parallel may have brought Lion a deeper understanding of the Emperor's guarded nature, though Lionel Johnson's emotional suppression may have limited his own ability to understand or articulate this connection. Sanguinius, facing Horus without the assurance of victory, Sanguinius, knowing his death was prophesied, confronted Horus on his battle barge with the hope that his sacrifice might pave the way for the emperor's possible victory. This mirrors the emperor's willingness to make difficult, uncertain sacrifices for the survival of humanity. Sanguinius may have understood that the emperor, too, faced decisions where victory was uncertain, but striving was necessary. It could have humanized the emperor's cold calculus, showing it to be driven by love rather than indifference, at least a little bit. This realization might explain Sanguinius's loyalty and compassion even in his final moments, bridging a gap that the emperor himself never fully closed. Lorgar, with the terrible knowledge of chaos, Lorgar's revelation of chaos would have been a bitter parallel to the emperor's own earlier encounter and bargain with these malevolent powers. For Lorgar, the disillusionment of learning the emperor's hidden knowledge may have sparked a complex empathy. Lorgar may have seen the emperor as someone who bore the same terrible weight he now carried, but chose to keep that burden to himself in an effort to protect humanity. However, Lorgar's turmoil, his emotional turmoil, his betrayal, it may have led him to twist that into resentment. The shared understanding of chaos might have been an opportunity for connection, but Lorgar's feelings of abandonment and betrayal and Chaos's lies that he swallowed wholesale prevented reconciliation. There are some alternative moments, maybe a little less sure. Horus bargaining with Chaos at Molech. His encounter at Molech was a deliberate mirror of the emperor's earlier actions with different intentions. This parallel might have offered Horus an opportunity to understand the emperor's decisions, though his own corruption distorted this potential connection. Magnus the Red at the shattering of Prospero. The devastation of Prospero, combined with the emperor's own disappointment in him, could have allowed Magnus to see some of the emperor's grief and regret. However, Magnus's feelings of failure and betrayal made this moment more divisive than unifying. Perturabo with the weight of unacknowledged labor. Perturabo's bitterness over his thankless role mirrors the emperor's thankless sacrifices for humanity. Had Perturabo recognized this, he might have found a kindred spirit in his father. It just happens that he did not. These moments suggest that while many Primarchs had the opportunity to understand some of the emperor's emotional burdens, their own flaws and their circumstances often prevented these connections from fully forming. Though each Primarch had similarities to the emperor, due in part to their embodying a facet of his personality, some of them were more similar to the emperor than were others. In certain portions of their lives, a select few Primarchs can be found to have had special opportunity to understand the emperor. Ferrus Manus had the personality most similar to that of the emperor, professional and emotionally detached. Horus came the closest to understanding the transcendental perspective of the godlike emperor after he attained immense power at Molech. Dorn had the opportunity to share in the immense grief which the emperor felt as the emperor was dying. Lionel Johnson had the opportunity to experience an immense weight of responsibility as his sons of the First Legion died by the tens of thousands in a war for survival against the Ranged, similar to how the emperor felt about the entire Great Crusade writ large, with billions of men in the imperial army dying at his order. Rabute Guilliman may have been able to appreciate the similarity between his own wounded stasis after being wounded by Fulgrim and the emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne. Rabute also may have understood the crushing weight of rulership when he returned from stasis and became imperial regent, just as the emperor had felt when he was alive and leading the Imperium personally. I wonder at whether any of them gained any profound insight into their father from this, or whether the opportunity came and went without their noticing. What must it be like to admire one's own father and yet be left outside his confidence, unable to learn about his inner self by the normal method of speaking with him? Each Primarch's journey gave them echoes of the Emperor's experience, brief, mirrored glimpses of his inner world, but ultimately none could claim a full understanding of the man behind the myth. In many ways, the Emperor deliberately remained an enigma, bestowing upon each son the challenge of discovering their own path without his complete guidance. Ferrus Manus, with his professional detachment, saw the Emperor as a model of disciplined efficiency. Yet, while his similarities allowed him to mirror that aspect of his father, the emotional reserve that defined both of them meant that any deeper personal insights were obscured by formality and duty. Horus, after achieving immense power from chaos at Molech, touched upon a transcendental perspective, the kind that might have united ambition and spirituality. However, he had already fallen by then. This proximity to the Emperor's lofty vision fostered hubris, making him assume that he could grasp the Emperor's divine purpose fully and supplant him. In doing so, he mistook a fragmented insight for total understanding, leading to dangerous overconfidence, making him vulnerable to manipulation by chaos. Dorn, who shared in the profound grief of the Emperor's decline and entombment, might have felt the crushing weight of loss and responsibility. Yet even this shared sorrow was only a glimpse, a moment of resonance rather than a full revelation of the Emperor's inner life. Dorn's own sense of duty and loss could only parallel, not penetrate, the Emperor's vast reservoir of experience. Lionel Johnson encountered the heavy burden of responsibility through the loss of his sons. In that tragic weight, he saw an echo of the Emperor's own sacrifices and the challenges of leadership. But while such experiences may have kindled empathy, they never bridged the chasm between his personal grief and the Emperor's cosmic vision. Rabute Guilliman experienced rulership and isolation, first through his own stasis-induced wounds, and later, in his return, isolated as the imperial regent. Although this allowed him to tangentially appreciate the Emperor's sacrifices and his reliance on the Golden Throne, it also cemented a distance. The Emperor's enigmatic nature meant that Guilliman's understanding remained functional rather than profoundly personal. In essence, these moments of shared experience, of duty, grief, transcendence, or isolation, offered each Primarch fleeting insight into the Emperor's nature. But the deeper, more intimate understanding of a father's inner self was always out of reach. They admired him from afar, often interpreting his actions through the lens of their own experiences, and thus constructing personal models of what the Emperor represented. Yet, that admiration was always coupled with a sense of exclusion, a frustration at never being invited fully into his confidence, not even Horus. This perpetual distance, intentional or not, ensured that while the Primarchs might reflect parts of the Emperor in themselves, they would forever remain in some fundamental way outside his inner sanctum. On the sojourn of Jesus Christ on earth, he ate and drank and danced and laughed and suffered alongside his apostles, rather than holding himself aloof and private. Jesus told everyone over and over again exactly who he was, rather than maintaining the emotional distance one would expect from the omniscient. He brought himself down to the level of the most lowly, to help lift them up and tell them how much they are loved, how much we are loved. And then there's the Emperor in Warhammer 40,000, whose power was exceeded only by his dispassion. Is it too much to ask for him to be human? The Emperor's dispassion is very much a deliberate narrative choice. Perhaps it was written as necessary armor in a universe where sentimentality can be fatal weakness. Unlike Christ, who deliberately embraced human frailty to connect with and uplift others, the Emperor's role is defined by a cold, calculated drive for humanity's survival. Perhaps his detachment is not so much a rejection of humanity as it is the price of bearing the weight of an entire species' destiny. In the grim darkness of the 41st or 31st millennium, vulnerability can be exploited, and the Emperor sacrificed much of his personal warmth to build and sustain a rational imperium against unimaginable odds. That said, there are moments, both in lore and in the interpretations of his actions, where hints of humanity peek through, glimpses of empathy and sacrifice that remind us he once was more than an unyielding strategist. However, the cost of that humanity is high. In choosing to be a symbol of order and resilience rather than a warm, approachable mentor, the Emperor reflects the universe he governs, a place where hope is often cold and hard-won, and where the ideals of compassion must sometimes yield to the necessities of survival. So while it may be a comforting thought to imagine the Emperor as more openly human, a leader who laughs, suffers, and shares his life intimately with his subjects, was the reality of his burden that such openness could jeopardize the very future he fought to secure? No! 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 I completely reject that. The universe is cold and unforgiving only when we are also. The Imperium is such a dystopian nightmare only because the Emperor's choices made it so. By succumbing to the siren song of necessity and pragmatism and expedience, the Emperor shut out all the benefits which flow from building society upon a foundation of real human connection. The roots of the Imperium's greatest problems can be found in the emotional wounds of the Primarchs. With these pieces of evidence, which we shall discuss to support the Fisher King idea when we talk about each individual Primarch, we can see that the great dystopian parody of the Imperium is meant to teach us exactly this. Mistreatment and neglect can only ever lead to bad outcomes, regardless of intent. You cannot sacrifice humanity in order to serve humanity. Instead of seeing the Imperium as an inevitable response to an unforgiving universe, I argue that its dystopian nature is the direct result of deliberate decisions to eschew genuine human connection in favor of cold pragmatism and expediency. Remember the Fisher King trope. Wounded leadership results in a barren, fractured land. Consider these points. The cost of emotional neglect. The Emperor, in prioritizing order and the survival of humanity, chose a path of emotional detachment by denying himself and the Primarchs the opportunity to fully understand, experience, and express the depth of human connection. He left deep emotional wounds. These wounds, carried by the Primarchs and their legions, became seeds for long-term societal decay. There was a missed opportunity for healing. Whereas Jesus embraced human vulnerability to uplift others, the Emperor's decision to remain aloof prevented him from providing the emotional sustenance that might have nurtured a more resilient, connected Imperium.
the absence of authentic bonds among the ruling class set a precedent, a neglect of the human spirit that continues to haunt the Imperium. Then there's the legacy of the Primarch's wounds. The emotional scars of the Primarchs, who were each given only a fragmentary glimpse of their father's true nature, speak to a broader systemic failure. The fractured relationships and isolated existences of these superhuman figures mirror the fractured state of the Imperium itself. This suggests that even well-intentioned actions, if they ignore the fundamental human need for connection, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. This is a cautionary tale. The Imperium was not a necessary adaptation to an inhospitable cosmos, but rather a tragic byproduct of leadership that neglected the power of empathy and community. It warns us that the abandonment of genuine human connection, even when done with noble intentions, can sow the seeds of tyranny, stagnation, and perpetual suffering. In essence, the Imperium stands as a dystopian parody, a realm where the promise of a united, hopeful humanity was sacrificed on the altar of necessity and pragmatic control. I challenge you to reconsider what might have been possible if leaders embraced their humanity, recognized the true strength of a society lying in its capacity for compassion, vulnerability, and genuine capacity. In essence, the Imperium stands as a dystopian parody, a realm where the promise of a united, hopeful humanity was sacrificed on the altar of necessity and pragmatic control. I challenge you all to reconsider what might be possible if leaders embrace their humanity, recognizing that the true strength of a society lies in its capacity for compassion, vulnerability, and genuine connection. The Emperor achieved great and terrible things, and performed deeds both sacred and vile in his efforts to amass enough power to save humanity. He performed acts of such profound hypocrisy that it staggers belief, molded people into tools unrecognizable as their previous form, and then disposed of them the instant they were no longer useful, and attempted to kill gods with a creed of ignorance. He sacrificed his own humanity to his vision of what a leader is. The Emperor has it backwards, for it is only through the risks associated with human emotions that the Primarchs could achieve their full potential. This giant warrior with a flaming sword at the head of a gold-armored host comes to a planet, casually performs psychic feats of impossible, miraculous magnitude, and then says with a straight face that he is not a god. It's no wonder Lorgar didn't believe him and worshipped him anyway. Of course, Lorgar also has it backwards, for in the knowledge that the Emperor is a man, is fallible, he should be more overawed. For a real god, the worldly puissance of the Imperium would be trifling. For a man, the achievement of interstellar evangelistic empire takes a level of genius and single-mindedness verging on madness, or perhaps madness's cold mirror. A god-made man has all the weakness of perfection. A man-made god has all the might of his flaws. If the Emperor had allowed himself to be human, to be a father, his eventual achievements would have been all the more impressive. But more importantly, his emotional risks would have had the possibility of gigantic payoff by rescuing the most vulnerable Primarchs. This is the profoundly tragic truth at the heart of the Emperor's story. His overwhelming vision, his boundless ambition, and his staggering hypocrisy all create a figure who is lessened, not strengthened, by his denial of his humanity. The emperor's refusal to embrace the emotional risks of being a father, to see his sons as flawed but precious beings rather than disposable tools, was perhaps his greatest failure. The emperor, a god who refused to be a father. The emperor's paradox is staggering. He performs godlike feats but denies divinity. He builds an universal empire but refuses to acknowledge its humanity. By presenting himself as infallible and distant, he robs his Primarchs of the one thing many of them so desperately need: connection. The emperor has hypocrisy as the base of his methodology. The emperor uses deception and manipulation to further his goals, violating his own principles at every turn. He decries superstition, but leans on the mystique of his godlike image to awe and subjugate. He insists on the imperial truth, a creed of reason, while secretly harnessing psychic powers that his subjects consider miraculous. His refusal to allow himself to be human, to risk vulnerability or failure, is the most damning hypocrisy of all. He creates the Primarchs to be paragons of humanity, yet he denies them the very human experiences of love, guidance, and acceptance that would enable them to reach their full potential. The consequences of denial are dire. By refusing to engage emotionally with his sons, the emperor ensures that their flaws will fester unchecked. Magnus, consumed by hubris, Angron by rage, Perturabo by bitterness, all because the emperor will not take the risk of reaching out to them as a father. His cold detachment turns his greatest strength, his ability to inspire and lead, into his greatest weakness and his worst failure. He's a leader without love, a father without connection. He's a god without faith. Lorgar's tragedy lies in his misplaced reverence. He sees the emperor's father and cannot fathom that it comes from a fallible, mortal man. To Lorgar, the emperor must be a god, because only a god could achieve what he has. And yet, in this belief, Lorgar misses the greater truth. The emperor's humanity is what makes his achievements extraordinary. He has the false worship of perfection. Lorgar worships the emperor as a god, because, among other reasons, he cannot reconcile the idea that a man could achieve such greatness. This blind faith blinds him to the emperor's flaws, his many, many flaws, making his eventual disillusionment all the more devastating. In his rebellion, Lorgar replaces one false god with other false gods, failing to recognize that the true miracle is not divinity, but humanity. The ability to strive, fail, and succeed despite one's mortal limitations. And so that brings us to the awe of imperfection. The realization that the emperor is not a god, but a man, should inspire greater reverence, not less. A god might create an empire as easily as breathing, but for a mortal man to do so is an act of impossible willpower and genius. Lorgar's failure to see this truth is matched only by his father's failure to embrace it. Both are caught in a false dichotomy: divinity or nothing. The emperor denies his humanity, while Lorgar denies the value of mortal achievement. Both fail because they cannot reconcile the beauty of imperfection. The insight that a God-made man is fragile, but a man-made God has the power of his flaws is central to the tragedy of Warhammer 40,000 in both the story of the Emperor and the story of the craft world Eldar. The Emperor's greatness is born of his humanity, not his divinity. but his refusal to embrace that humanity ensures his failure. If the emperor were truly divine, his hypocrisy, his failures, and occasional defeats would be unthinkable. His flaws would shatter the image of godhood. A god who lies, manipulates, and abandons his children is no god at all. The emperor's power is undermined by his insistence on perfection. By denying his humanity, he becomes less than human, not more. He becomes cold, distant, and incapable of love and human connection. As a man, the emperor's achievements are awe-inspiring. He unites a fractured galaxy, creates the Primarchs, defeats multiple existential threats, and leads humanity to heights it had only known in the dark age of technology, all while carrying the flaws and limitations of a mortal mind. His flaws, if embraced and talked about like a person, could have been his greatest strength. By connecting with his sons as a father, by accepting their flaws and his own, the emperor could have forged bonds strong enough to withstand the temptations of chaos. Yes, there are emotional risks associated with parenthood. The emperor's refusal to risk emotional vulnerability is the ultimate tragedy of his story. Had he embraced his role as a father, he might have saved his sons and himself. The emperor sacrificed his humanity for his vision of leadership, either metaphorically or possibly literally. But this made him incapable of understanding or guiding his sons. His refusal to connect emotionally left them isolated, vulnerable, and desperate for validation. The emotional risks of fatherhood, love, vulnerability, the possibility of failure and loss, are what make the rewards of connection and loyalty possible. The emperor's refusal to take these risks ensured that he could never truly bond with his sons. Imagine if the emperor had reached out to Magnus, not as a teacher, but also as a father, to help him navigate his struggles with the warp. Imagine if he had comforted and fought alongside Angron, supported and validated Perturabo, forgiven Lorgar. These emotional risks might have saved the Imperium, not through strength or power, but through love and understanding. The Emperor's refusal to embrace his humanity, to take the emotional risks of fatherhood, is what ultimately ensures his failure. His greatest achievements are not diminished by his humanity. They are made greater by his humanity. They are diminished by his rejection of his humanity. His rejection of humanity turns his strength into weakness, his vision into a nightmare, and his empire into a tomb. Lorgar's worship and the Emperor's denial are two sides of the same coin. Both fail to see the power and beauty of flawed humanity. In their blindness, they ensure the tragedy of Warhammer 40,000, a galaxy where the dream of unity is drowned in the darkness of isolation, fear, and unending war. Would you like to explore how specific Primarchs, such as Magnus, Lorgar, or Sanguinius, might have been saved if the Emperor had embraced emotional risk? Or perhaps, would you like to consider how stories from 40K work together with other tragic figures in literature and mythology? Well, I have good news for you. I plan to do exactly that sort of thing in this series of videos. There is some disagreement among various canonical sources about the next bit. Just go with it. You've already watched this far. What do you have to lose? The most human moment of the Emperor's life. Victorious against Horus. His two most beloved sons dead alongside him on the ground, of the vengeful spirit, the deck, whatever. The Emperor lays mortally wounded. Dorn fights his way into the room. The Emperor whispers to him with his last breath his instructions for how to adapt the Golden Throne into a life support mechanism. Dorn cradles his father's broken body like a mortal tenderly caring for a sick elderly relative, no longer attempting to hide how much he cares for the Emperor as a father, knowing that he will never be the same as he was, knowing that he will never rise from the Golden Throne. In this moment of profound grief, the Emperor finds the closest moment of emotional vulnerability of his life, and Dorn comes the closest of anyone to understanding the Emperor's inner life. And so we come to the biggest question of the lives of Dorn and the Emperor. Why did it take the Emperor's death for him to find a moment of emotional vulnerability with one of his sons? To understand why it took the Emperor's death for such a connection to occur, we must consider both the Emperor's own nature and his relationship with his Primarchs. The Emperor's perspective on his own role. The Emperor was a being of almost incomprehensible power and intellect, but his vision for humanity demanded that he suppress much of his own humanity. The burden of godhood. The Emperor saw himself not as a father to his sons, but as the architect of a grand plan to unify humanity. His distance from the Primarchs was partly a belief that personal attachments and emotional vulnerability would compromise his objectivity and authority. To the Emperor, his sons were tools, albeit extraordinary ones, to achieve his vision. Emotional bonds, in his eyes, could cloud their purpose and create weaknesses. The Emperor was acutely aware of his own flaws and the enormity of his responsibilities. Allowing himself to be emotionally vulnerable with his sons might have exposed his own doubts and failures, something he could not afford to show in the context of the Great Crusade or the heresy. By maintaining an aura of infallibility, he sought to inspire absolute loyalty and avoid the chaos that could arise from his sons questioning him. And so now we should look at Rogel Dorn's life, his role in the Emperor's life. Rogel Dorn was a reflection of many of the Emperor's own ideals. Duty, sacrifice, the prioritization of the greater good over personal desires. He was the Emperor's stoic servant. Dorn's stoicism and relentless sense of duty mirrored the Emperor's own. This similarity may have reinforced the emotional distance between them, as they both buried their humanity beneath their responsibilities. Dorn's loyalty was unquestionable, but his lack of overt emotional displays may have prevented the Emperor from recognizing how deeply his son cared for him. They had only unspoken respect. The Emperor valued Dorn's steadfastness, but he rarely expressed this openly. Similarly, Dorn revered the Emperor as both a leader and a father, but struggled to convey his feelings. Their shared restraint created this unfortunate gulf between them, at least until the catalyst of death. The Emperor's impending death, or half-death, broke the barriers that he had so carefully constructed throughout his life. This mortality was an equalizer, in his final moments, stripped of his godlike power and faced with the failure of his dreams, the deaths of his two most beloved sons on the deck next to him, the Emperor could no longer maintain the facade of infallibility. He was reduced to a dying father, desperate to leave a legacy that would ensure humanity's survival. This moment of vulnerability allowed him to connect with Dorn on a deeply human level, acknowledging their shared grief and the sacrifices they had both made. This was Dorn's breaking point. He was overwhelmed by the weight of loss and responsibility. The death of his brothers, the devastation of Terra, the impending loss of the Emperor left him unable to maintain his usual stoicism. This mutual vulnerability created a rare, maybe unique moment of genuine connection between them, freed from the constraints of duty and expectation. But why did it take so long? The Emperor and Dorn's inability to connect emotionally earlier in their lives was a result of their shared prioritization of duty over personal bonds. Theirs was a relationship built on functionality and utility. The Emperor's relationship with all of his sons was built on their roles in his grand design, not on personal affection. While he may have loved them in his own way, that's difficult to tell, he saw them primarily or exclusively as instruments of his will. Dorn's own nature reinforced this dynamic, as he never sought the kind of personal connection that might have forced the Emperor to engage with him on a deeper level. And so theirs was unspoken filial love. The Emperor and Dorn cared deeply for each other, but their inability to express this, even to themselves, created tragic distance between them. Only in the face of death, when all pretense and purpose fell away, could they acknowledge the bond they shared. It took the Emperor's death to create a moment of emotional vulnerability, because his entire existence was defined by the suppression of his humanity in service to his vision. Similarly, Dorn's life was defined by his unyielding commitment to duty and his reluctance to express his emotions. In the end, their shared moment of grief and understanding was as much an acknowledgement of what they had lost as it was a reflection of what they had always been. Two beings bound by duty, sacrifice, and an unspoken love that they only allowed themselves to express when it was too late. This tragedy underscores the central theme of the Horus Heresy: the cost of ambition, duty, and the suppression of human connection in the pursuit of a grand but flawed vision. God, that's sad. In a story about demigods, the greatest tragedies are all about their unwillingness or inability to form human emotional connections. For all its grand scale, the Warhammer 40,000 universe resonates most deeply when it explores the personal, human struggles of its characters. Those moments of love, loss, and regret amidst the unrelenting tide of war and ambition. The story of the Primarchs, especially figures like Dorn, reminds us that even the most powerful beings can be undone by their inability to to embrace vulnerability and connection. Listen, guys, maybe pause the video. Take all the time you need to process. It's heavy stuff. This weight speaks to how well these stories capture the depth of the human condition, but it's not always a fun thing to capture. Feel free to pause and come back later, but only if you like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that bell, go make your own fucking video. The Emperor's only real moment of emotional vulnerability. Dying. Talking with Dorn as best he can, next to the corpses of his two favorite sons, Sanguinius and Horus, on the deck next to him. His attempts to detach, to shield himself from grief, have completely failed as much as they could have. This moment, the Emperor's confrontation with his own failure and grief, is one of the most poignant in the entirety of the Warhammer 40,000 narrative. It encapsulates the tragedy of his vision and the sacrifices he demanded, not only from others, but ultimately from himself. Trapped in half-death, entombed on the Golden Throne, the Emperor faced the ultimate consequences of his hubris and detachment. His two most beloved sons, Sanguinius, the angelic paragon of virtue and loyalty, and Horus, the favored and most human of his children, were dead, one by betrayal and one by sacrifice. Dorn, the stalwart defender, was left to bear witness to this moment of profound loss and failure. In this scene, we see the Emperor as a being capable of grief and regret, stripped of his usual omnipotence and infallibility. Yes, there is disagreement among canon sources about what exactly happened. Deal with it. The Emperor's attempts to shield himself emotionally, denying his bonds with his sons, delegating the enforcement of his will, retreating into cold pragmatism and expediency, had utterly failed. These efforts, designed to protect him from the emotional toll of his monumental task, only alienated him from those who might have supported him most effectively. By denying his sons the emotional connection they sought, he fostered resentment and misunderstanding, creating a gulf that chaos exploited to devastating effect. In this final moment, the futility of his detachment was laid bare. Gone were the power and planning. The Emperor had to prevent them. In this final moment, the futility of his detachment was laid bare. Despite all his power and planning, now gone, the Emperor could not prevent the most personal and profound losses, the deaths of his sons and the shattering of his dream. The Emperor's vulnerability in this scene suggests that his denial of emotional bonds was not a true absence of feeling, but a deliberate suppression of it. His grief, deferred for millennia, overwhelmed him in his dying moments all at once, revealing the depth of his humanity only to Dorn. It also highlights the tragic irony of his existence, a being of unparalleled power who failed in the simplest and most vital human connection, that of a father to his children. This moment underscores the enduring tragedy of the Emperor's legacy. His detachment, intended to serve the Imperium, ultimately contributed to its near collapse. The lesson for his surviving sons and for the Imperium as a whole is a bitter one. The cost of denying one's humanity, even in pursuit of a greater good, can be catastrophic. In a way, the Emperor's death and the aftermath serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation, the need for genuine connection, and the inescapable consequences of emotional neglect. It is both a fitting end to his character arc and a sobering reflection on the sacrifices demanded by the pursuit of perfection. But let's go back a little bit. It is conceivable that the Emperor was worried that the faith being spread by the word-bearers pre-Monarchia would reach a critical mass and force the emperor into godhood, which we will discuss later in the Lorgar video. If that's the case, the earnest faith of so many coming together for so long would have changed his very nature in the warp until apotheosis could happen against his will. But then the much greater scale of the ecclesiarchy as the state religion of the Imperium for the following 10,000 years must have surely tipped him past that critical mass long ago. Remember two things here. When the Imperium has a great victory or suffers a terrible loss, it often changes in response, instead of just going back to how things were before. Sometimes the change is for the better. The Emperor is a Fisher King figure par excellence. If the Emperor had once feared that the word-bearer's faith could force him into apotheosis, then the scale of the ecclesiarchy must have long since made that a reality. This raises a few fascinating possibilities. Maybe the Emperor has already changed. If faith in the warp shapes reality, then 10,000 years of unwavering belief may have transformed the Emperor into a god, even though he did not want that. The Fisher King metaphor suggests again that his wounds are mirrored in the Imperium's own decay. Since the Imperium is stagnant, that shows us that the Emperor is too, both spiritually and physically, on the Golden Throne. If the Emperor were ever to wake, would he still be the same being that sat upon the Golden Throne? Other option. The Emperor's apotheosis as the Imperium's great victory. Perhaps the Emperor resisted godhood before, but is now too far gone. If the Imperium does not return to what it was, but becomes something new in response to important events, could the Emperor awaken as an active divine force in the warp rather than a dying god? Could his transformation be the next great upheaval of the Imperium, sweeping the cicatrix maledictum from reality, one that leads to change rather than further decay? Or the Emperor's apotheosis as the Imperium's great wound? If the Emperor was forced into godhood against his will, then his continued existence may be a torment rather than an ascension, and there is some canonical evidence for this. The ecclesiarchy's faith has grown so powerful it may bind the Emperor as much as it sustains him. Perhaps he wants to die, but is denied even that release. Lorgar, ironically, ultimately won their philosophical conflict. He proved the Emperor's divinity, but in doing so, he helped trap the Emperor in a divine state that he never wanted. In canon, there are certain radical inquisitors who believe that the Golden Throne, keeping the Emperor's body alive, anchoring him to reality, is preventing him from attaining the true measure of his godhood. The mainstream view, of course, is that if his body died, then it would be a catastrophe. Both may be true, or neither. This is one of the greatest uncertainties in 40K. What happens if the Emperor finally dies? I really hope that Games Workshop explores this. It would be such a great plot point. Both radical and mainstream Inquisitors have plausible arguments. The radical view, the Emperor's body is a shackle. If faith shapes reality in the warp, then the Golden Throne may be preventing the Emperor from reaching his full divine potential as a fully transcendent being with no physical body. The Emperor's body is dying, but his soul remains bound to it. What if releasing it would allow him to ascend fully and act with true godlike power? This would align with the belief that his continued weakened state mirrors the Imperium's stagnation, his Fisher King wounds, keeping humanities trapped. The mainstream view, of course, is that the Emperor's death would doom humanity. The Golden Throne sustains the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon in the warp, which allows for faster-than-light travel to be possible. Without it, Imperial ships cannot navigate the warp safely. If the Emperor died, the Imperium could collapse into darkness, a new age of strife. The Emperor's will actively fights off demonic incursions, including faith in the Emperor, fighting off the whispers of chaos in the minds of psychers. His death could remove this final psychic bulwark, thus making the psychic awakening in the realm of 40,000 be more of a problem. If the Imperium changes instead of simply returning to its past glories, then the Emperor's stagnation may be a necessary holding pattern, a sacrifice to ensure that change only happens at the right moment. Both may be true, or neither. The Emperor's death may be his apotheosis, or it may be his final doom. Faith does not always shape the warp in predictable ways. If he is the Fisher King figure of the Imperium, then his restoration might require a sacrifice. But what that sacrifice must be is unknown. It cannot be worth the risk to test it, unless there is no other choice. This is the central tension of the current setting. Does the Imperium cling to the dying god and rotting empire it knows, or does it risk everything for the possibility of salvation? I really hope Games Workshop explores this.